Hello, everyone. I'm Mr. Edison, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin. My name is Anton, and I am from Germany. Please forgive any imperfections in my English. I learned to speak it primarily through American television shows and during my visits to the United States, teaching myself through immersion and determination. I'm an adventurer and hiker by nature, spending the majority of my free time camping and hiking throughout Europe. Every location worth visiting on our continent I have explored extensively, but the rest of the world remained unexplored territory for me. For many years, I harbored a deep fascination with the Appalachian Mountains, the setting of countless terrifying stories and atmospheric adventures I had encountered through various media. The reputation of these ancient peaks called to something primal within me. As a dedicated solo hiker, I have always challenged myself to explore and survive in wilderness environments completely alone. This approach has always suited my solitary nature perfectly. Throughout all my European expeditions, I had encountered only a handful of minor troubling incidents, nothing that couldn't be handled with experience and common sense. This track record of success, combined with perhaps foolish confidence, led me to embark on what would become the most harrowing experience of my life. A solo visit to the Appalachian Trail during the summer of 2014. I flew across the Atlantic Ocean for my first extended visit to the United States, initially staying with online friends I had known for several years, through hiking forums and adventure communities. These friends were experienced American outdoorsmen who understood both the beauty and dangers of their homeland's wilderness areas. After spending a few days acclimatizing to the time zone and gathering final supplies, I rented a reliable four-wheel drive vehicle and began the drive toward the section of the Appalachian Trail I had chosen for my adventure. Before departing, I'd solemnly promised my American friends that I would follow the marked trail system rigidly, never deviating from the established paths. They had expressed genuine concern about my plan to tackle this challenging terrain alone, especially as a foreign visitor unfamiliar with the specific dangers and quirks of American wilderness areas. However, even as I spoke these reassuring words, I harbored secret intentions to let the wilderness guide me wherever it beckoned. The structured, controlled nature of marked trails had never appealed to my sense of adventure. I craved the unknown, the unexplored, the paths less traveled. The drive through the foothills revealed landscapes unlike anything I had experienced in Europe. The sheer scale of the American wilderness was breathtaking, with rolling hills that seemed to stretch endlessly toward distant mountain peaks shrouded in morning mist. Small towns dotted the countryside, their inhabitants waving friendly greetings to passing travelers. Everything felt larger, more expansive, more wild than the carefully managed forests and hiking trails I knew so well back home. I did manage to stick to the official trail markers for the first day and a half of my journey, following the white blazes painted on trees and rocks that indicated the proper route. The trail was well maintained and clearly marked, with regular campsites and water sources exactly where my maps indicated they should be. Other hikers passed occasionally, offering friendly nods and brief conversations about trail conditions ahead. Everything proceeded exactly as my American friends had hoped it would. However, on the afternoon of my second day, I encountered a divergence that would change everything. A narrow, barely visible path branched off from the main trail, winding upward through dense forest toward what appeared to be a pristine wilderness area unmarked on any of my maps. The pull of exploration proved irresistible. Drawing upon my many years of experience as a wilderness navigator, I carefully noted my departure point and began documenting my new route with compass bearings and landmark observations. Keeping accurate track of my position and route had never presented problems for me in the past. I possessed well-developed orienteering skills and carried multiple navigation tools, including compass, GPS device, detailed topographical maps, and backup paper materials. The decision to leave the marked trail felt calculated and safe, not reckless or impulsive. The unmarked path led me into a section of forest that seemed touched by something ancient and untamed. The trees grew larger here, massive specimens that dwarfed anything I had encountered in European forests. Towering oaks, maples, and hickories created a canopy so dense that sunlight filtered through in scattered beams, creating an almost cathedral-like atmosphere. The undergrowth grew thick and wild, filled with unfamiliar plants, and the sounds of unseen wildlife moving through the shadows. As afternoon gradually transitioned toward evening, I discovered a small, perfectly circular pond nestled in a natural clearing. The water appeared crystal clear, fed by a gentle stream that bubbled down from higher elevations. The setting possessed an almost magical quality that took my breath away. Here was the untouched American wilderness I had dreamed of experiencing, raw, beautiful, and completely isolated from human civilization. The contrast between this pristine wilderness and the managed landscapes of Germany struck me profoundly. Back home, even our most remote hiking areas showed signs of human management and maintenance. Here, nature seemed to rule absolutely. Following its own ancient rhythms without interference or control, I decided immediately that this secluded clearing beside the pond would serve as my campsite for the night. The location offered everything a wilderness camper could desire: fresh water, level ground for my tent, protection from wind, and an abundance of dead wood for a campfire. Most importantly, it provided the solitude and connection with nature that I had traveled thousands of miles to experience. As I began setting up my camp, the late afternoon sun painted the surrounding trees in brilliant shades of gold and amber. The forest felt alive with the sounds of birds calling to each other across the canopy, the gentle splash of fish jumping in the pond, and the rustling of small animals moving through the undergrowth. Everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect, as if I had stumbled upon some hidden paradise tucked away in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. I pitched my lightweight tent on a flat area about 30 feet from the water's edge, positioning it so that I could enjoy an unobstructed view of the pond while remaining safely away from any nocturnal animals that might come to drink. My camping equipment, carefully selected through years of European adventures, performed flawlessly in this new environment. The tent erected quickly and securely. My sleeping system provided excellent insulation from the ground, and my portable stove heated water efficiently for dinner and hot tea. As darkness gradually settled over the forest, I built a modest campfire in a ring of stones I constructed near the water's edge. The flames danced cheerfully, casting warm light across the clearing and reflecting beautifully off the still surface of the pond. I prepared a simple but satisfying meal of dehydrated food, supplemented with local stream water, and sat beside the fire, absorbing the profound silence and tranquility of this remarkable place. The night sky above the clearing revealed itself as darkness deepened, displaying more stars than I had seen in years. European skies, even in remote areas, rarely offered such spectacular celestial displays due to light pollution from distant cities and towns. Here, countless stars sparkled with brilliant clarity, and the Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a luminous river. I felt deeply grateful for this opportunity to experience such pristine wilderness. Exactly as I had hoped when planning this adventure, I remained by the fire until well past midnight, reluctant to end this perfect evening and retreat to my tent. The warmth of the flames, the beauty of the starlit sky, and the profound peace of the wilderness created a sense of contentment I had rarely experienced, even during my most successful European expeditions. Eventually, however, fatigue began to overcome my desire to extend the evening, and I carefully extinguished the fire, ensuring that every ember was completely dead and cold. Crawling into my tent, I arranged my sleeping gear and settled in for what I expected would be a peaceful night's rest. The sounds of the forest at night differed dramatically from the European woodlands I knew so well. Unfamiliar bird calls echoed through the trees. Insects chirped and buzzed with different rhythms and tones, and occasionally I heard the distant splash of something large moving through the pond water. None of these sounds alarmed me. They simply represented the normal nighttime activity of a healthy, vibrant ecosystem. I must have drifted off to a light doze while listening to these forest sounds, because I was startled awake by something completely different. At first, I couldn't identify exactly what had awakened me, but gradually I became aware of new sounds filtering through the tent walls. These weren't the natural sounds of wildlife or wind through trees. They were clearly artificial, clearly human in origin. The first sounds I could clearly distinguish were howling voices, rising and falling in a pattern that seemed almost musical, but carried an underlying tone of menace that made my heart rate increase immediately. Initially, I wondered if I might be hearing a pack of wolves or coyotes, animals I knew inhabited these mountains but had never encountered personally. However, as I listened more carefully, the sounds clearly resolved into human voices, though distorted and strange in ways I couldn't explain. The howling gradually settled into what I could unmistakably recognize as human speech, though the words remained unclear at first. The voices seemed to come from multiple directions around my campsite, suggesting that several people had approached my location under cover of darkness. My previous experiences in European wilderness areas had never included encounters with potentially hostile humans, and I felt a growing sense of unease that was entirely new to me. Slowly, carefully, I reached for my hunting knife, the only weapon I carried, as obtaining firearms as a German tourist in the United States had proven too complicated for my brief visit. The familiar weight of the knife in my hand provided some comfort, though I realized it would offer limited protection against multiple attackers if their intentions proved hostile. As I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, gripping my knife and straining to hear every sound, the voices outside my tent became clearer and more organized. What had initially sounded like random howling now resolved into a coordinated chant that sent waves of terror through my body in ways I had never experienced before. The words they repeated over and over penetrated through the thin fabric of my tent with bone-chilling clarity. If you leave, you'll die. If you leave, you'll die. The voices came from different directions around my campsite, confirming my suspicion that multiple people had surrounded my tent while I slept. The coordination of their chanting suggested organization and planning, rather than a random encounter with disturbed individuals. Someone, or multiple someones, had deliberately sought out my isolated campsite for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. Summoning what courage I could manage, I called out to them, my voice cracking slightly with fear and confusion. "Leave where?" I asked, hoping to engage them in some form of rational dialogue that might reveal their intentions. The response came immediately, spoken in unison by what sounded like at least 3 or 4 different voices. "Leave the tent." The implication hit me like a physical blow. They were telling me that if I emerged from my tent, I would die. The threat couldn't be more explicit or terrifying. I was trapped in a fabric shelter that would provide no protection whatsoever if they decided to attack. Yet they were explicitly warning me that leaving this inadequate protection would result in my death. "Will you kill me?" I managed to ask, though my voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Silence followed my question, a silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity while my mind raced through possible explanations and potential escape strategies. The lack of response somehow felt more ominous than any verbal threat could have been. It suggested that my survival or death was not entirely in their hands, that there might be other factors at play that I couldn't understand. Then the howling resumed, louder and more aggressive than before, and I heard a new voice speak the chant, "If you leave, you'll die." What followed next transformed my campsite into a scene from my darkest nightmares. The sound of footsteps began circling my tent. Not one person, but multiple individuals walking slowly around my position. Their footfalls seemed deliberately heavy, designed to ensure I could hear their movements and understand that I was completely surrounded with no possibility of escape. Fear gripped me with an intensity I had never experienced during all my years of solo wilderness adventures. This wasn't the manageable anxiety of being lost or facing bad weather. This was primal terror, the kind of fear that our ancestors must have felt when facing mortal danger in the darkness. My entire body began trembling uncontrollably, and I struggled to maintain any semblance of rational thought. Was this to be the end of my life? Here in this foreign country that I had admired and respected for so long? Would my adventure-seeking nature finally prove to be my downfall, leading to my death at the hands of unknown Americans in some remote wilderness area where my body might never be found? The irony struck me that I had survived countless solo expeditions in European forests that locals considered dangerous, only to meet my fate in the very place I had dreamed of exploring. I shifted slightly in my sleeping bag, trying to find a position that might allow for quick movement if escape became necessary. The fabric rustled softly, and immediately a voice called back from directly outside my tent, "Do not come out." The command carried an authority that suggested these people were accustomed to being obeyed. However, the fact that they continued to warn me against leaving the tent rather than simply attacking provided a thin thread of hope that perhaps their intentions weren't entirely murderous. Maybe they were playing some kind of cruel game or testing me for reasons I couldn't understand. Suddenly, the sound of running footsteps broke the pattern of slow circling. Multiple people seemed to be moving quickly around the campsite, and I heard shouts and commotion that appeared to have nothing directly to do with me. Voices called to each other in what sounded like coordinated activity, though I couldn't make out specific words or understand what they were doing. A new voice spoke from outside my tent, closer than the others had been. "Stay put." The command felt different from the previous warnings, less threatening, almost protective in tone. I remained motionless, hardly daring to breathe while trying to interpret the meaning of this rapidly changing situation. To my shock and growing terror, I suddenly saw the light from my campfire flaring back to life, illuminating the interior of my tent with a warm orange glow. Someone had relit the fire I had so carefully extinguished hours earlier. The implications of this action sent another wave of panic through my already terrified mind. What if they intended to burn me alive in my tent? What if this was some kind of ritualistic execution that involved fire? I could see through the thin fabric of my tent that the fire was burning brightly, though it appeared to be in the same location where I had originally built it, not close enough to my tent to immediately threaten my safety. Still, the fact that unknown individuals could relight a fire with such apparent ease, while I cowered helplessly inside my shelter, drove home just how vulnerable and powerless I truly was in this situation. The sound that came next nearly stopped my heart entirely. A single gunshot, sharp and unmistakable, echoing through the forest around my campsite. The report was followed immediately by a second shot, then silence that seemed to ring in my ears. I'd never heard gunshots in person before, and the reality of their sound was far more shocking and visceral than anything I had experienced through movies or television. The voice outside my tent spoke again, with the same protective tone as before. "Stay put." My mind raced through terrible possibilities. Had someone just been killed? Were these people engaged in some kind of violent conflict with each other, using my campsite as their battleground? Was I witnessing a murder or multiple murders while trapped helplessly in my tent? The fact that they continued to instruct me to remain hidden suggested that emerging might expose me to whatever violence was occurring around me. I considered emerging with my knife and fighting for my life, But what could one man with a hunting knife accomplish against multiple armed individuals? The rational part of my mind insisted that my best chance for survival lay in following their instructions, remaining hidden and hoping that whatever was happening around me would eventually end without involving me directly. 2 more gunshots shattered the night air, followed by what sounded like hooting and laughter. The laughter was perhaps the most disturbing sound of all. It suggested that whoever was out there was enjoying themselves, taking pleasure in whatever violence or chaos they were creating. The combination of gunshots and laughter painted a picture of people who viewed human suffering as entertainment, which terrified me even more than simple violence motivated by anger or desperation. At some point during that endless, terrifying night, I noticed that the fire had been extinguished again. The disappearance of the orange glow from inside my tent allowed me to relax slightly, knowing that I would not be burned alive by unseen hands while cowering in my inadequate shelter. However, the relief was minimal. The threat of fire had been replaced by continued uncertainty about the intentions and whereabouts of the people who had surrounded my campsite. Somehow, despite the terror and adrenaline coursing through my system, exhaustion eventually overcame my fear. The human body and mind can only maintain peak alertness for so long before fatigue begins to assert itself. I must have finally passed out from sheer physical and emotional exhaustion, because the next thing I became aware of was sunlight filtering through the walls of my tent. For a brief, blissful moment upon awakening, I forgot entirely about the events of the previous night. My mind registered the warmth of the morning sun, the pleasant sounds of birds singing in the trees, and the peaceful atmosphere of my wilderness campsite. I felt the familiar urge to urinate that comes with waking up after a long night's sleep, and I began reaching for the tent zipper before memory came flooding back with devastating clarity. Everything returned to my consciousness in a rush: the chanting voices, the circling footsteps, the gunshots, the laughter. I froze with my hand on the zipper, suddenly terrified to emerge from my tent even in broad daylight. What if they were still out there, waiting for me to show myself? What if the apparent safety of morning sunlight was just an illusion? I called out tentatively, listening carefully for any response. Only silence greeted my voice, broken by the normal sounds of a forest awakening to a new day. Birds sang in the trees, insects buzzed through the warming air, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the gentle sound of water flowing over rocks in the stream that fed the pond. After several minutes of listening, without hearing any human sounds, I gripped my knife firmly and slowly unzipped the tent entrance. My heart pounded as I peered out into the morning light, half expecting to see threatening figures waiting for me to emerge. The clearing appeared completely normal and peaceful. Sunlight sparkled on the surface of the pond, and a light breeze rustled the leaves overhead. I could see no signs of the previous night's terrifying events, except for the fact that some of the undergrowth around my campsite had been trampled down, creating clear evidence that multiple people had indeed moved through the area during the night. However, sitting beside the cold remains of my campfire was something that definitely had not been there when I went to sleep: a 6-pack of beer, still in its cardboard carrier. The bottles appeared to be unopened, arranged neatly as if someone had placed them there as a gift or offering. I stared at the beer for several long minutes, trying to understand its significance. Was it some kind of peace offering? A payment for the terror they had inflicted upon me? A sign of respect for my compliance with their demands? Or perhaps just another element of whatever cruel game they had been playing? I didn't touch the beer. Something about it felt wrong, potentially dangerous. Instead, I quickly packed my camping equipment and prepared to leave this place that had transformed from paradise to nightmare in the space of a single night. 2 days later, I emerged from the Appalachian wilderness with my dream expedition cut dramatically short. The experience had shaken me to my core in ways that no European adventure had ever come close to matching. I have since returned to hike sections of the Appalachian Trail, but never again alone, and always within the safety of marked trail systems where other hikers travel regularly. I have asked many people what they think I may have experienced that night in the wilderness. Nobody has provided any clear answers, and I remain without any satisfying explanation for what occurred. Part of me wants to convince myself that I was the victim of an elaborate and cruel prank, but the memory of genuine terror I felt suggests that something far more serious was taking place around my campsite that night. They say strange and dangerous things happen in the Appalachian Mountains, that these ancient peaks hold secrets and harbor individuals who operate outside the boundaries of normal society. My beloved Germany has its own wilderness mysteries, but nothing quite as intense or threatening as what I encountered in that remote clearing beside a pristine mountain pond. I will return to Appalachia again someday. The beauty and wildness of those mountains continues to call to something deep within my adventurous spirit. However, when I do return, I will pray to God that I never again encounter those mysterious figures who surrounded my tent and filled one perfect night with unforgettable terror. I was alone at home that day, slouched on my worn couch, flipping through channels I didn't care about. The sky outside was grey, heavy with the threat of rain, so I figured the day would be as uneventful as it gets. The television droned on with mindless chatter from some afternoon talk show, but my attention kept drifting to the window. Living on the edge of town had its perks: quiet neighbors, minimal traffic, and wildlife that occasionally wandered through the yard. The house had been in my family for years, passed down from my grandmother who'd lived here alone for decades before her passing. I'd moved in 6 months ago, still adjusting to the isolation after years of apartment living in the city. The property backed up to dense woods that stretched for miles, a wall of green that seemed to press closer with each passing day. But at some point that afternoon, I noticed a few deer drifting into the yard. That sight usually brought a calm vibe, something I'd admire for a moment before going back to whatever I was doing. They'd appear in groups of 3 or 4, graceful and silent, picking their way across the grass to nibble at the overgrown patches near the tree line. I'd grown fond of watching them, these brief glimpses of nature that reminded me why I'd chosen this place over the noise and chaos of urban life. This time, though, something about them felt off. The air outside felt strangely still, like every sound had been sucked away, creating a vacuum that made my skin crawl. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Even the ever-present rustle of leaves had ceased, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The deer seemed normal at first. 3 does, and what looked like a young buck. Their brown coats dappled with white spots that caught what little light filtered through the clouds. But I kept my eyes on them a little longer than usual. Something nagged at me, a wrongness I couldn't quite identify. And that's when I realized one of their back legs was wrong. Every time it stepped, that leg bent in a direction I can't even begin to explain. Not backward like a bird's leg, not to the side like an injury might cause. It bent in multiple places, as if there were extra joints hidden beneath the fur, creating angles that shouldn't exist in any living creature. I leaned closer to the window, my mind fighting to make sense of what I was seeing. The glass fogged with my breath as I pressed against it, trying to get a better view. The more I watched, the more I realized it wasn't just the one leg. Several of the deer, 3, maybe 4, had some unnatural curve to their joints. Their movements were fluid, yet fundamentally wrong, like watching a marionette operated by someone who'd never seen how animals were supposed to move. I tried telling myself it had to be a trick of the light, a weird angle, anything that would explain it, but the way their limbs moved just wasn't natural. The lead doe lowered her head to graze, and I watched her front legs buckle in places where no joint should exist. Her knees bent forward, then sideways, then seemed to rotate in their sockets before straightening again. The motion was smooth, practiced, as if this was how she'd always moved. It felt like they were almost learning how to walk for the first time, except they were doing it wrong. Or maybe they were unlearning how to walk correctly, their bodies forgetting the rules that governed normal anatomy. They kept standing there, nibbling at the grass, occasionally glancing in my direction as though they sensed me watching from behind the glass. Those glances were what truly unnerved me. Deer eyes are usually soft, dark, almost innocent in their watchfulness. But these eyes held something else, an awareness that went beyond animal instinct. When they looked at me, I felt seen in a way that made my skin prickle with goosebumps. Not just observed, but studied, catalogued, understood in ways I couldn't comprehend. I didn't want to move, worried I'd scare them off, or, worse, attract their full attention. My breath caught in my throat every time one of them jerked its head up, ears twitching. Those ears moved independently, swiveling like satellite dishes searching for signals. Sometimes they'd point in opposite directions, creating an impossible spread that made their heads look momentarily alien. The yard was silent. No chirping birds or rustling leaves, and that silence made each awkward step echo in my mind. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and insistent, as if my body was trying to warn me of danger my conscious mind hadn't fully grasped yet. My pulse hammered in my ears with every movement they made. The young buck lifted his head, and I saw that his antlers were wrong too. They didn't branch like normal antlers should. Instead, they twisted and spiraled, creating loops and whirls that defied logic. In some places, the antlers seemed to phase through each other, occupying the same space in ways that hurt to look at directly. I blinked hard, hoping to clear my vision, but the impossibility remained. Eventually, one of the deer started to stroll toward the tree line at the edge of the yard. The others followed. Their procession was eerily coordinated, each animal maintaining the exact same distance from the others, moving in perfect synchronization despite their malformed gaits. That was when I noticed something even more unsettling. As they walked away, their bodies looked like they were growing. At first I was sure I was imagining it, a trick of perspective as they moved farther from the house. But I couldn't ignore how their torsos seemed to stretch, how their necks elongated to proportions that weren't possible. The transformation was gradual but undeniable, like watching taffy being pulled in slow motion. I found myself frozen in place, trying to piece together a scene that shouldn't exist. My rational mind screamed for explanations: disease, genetic mutations, chemical contamination from some nearby factory. But none of those could account for what I was witnessing. This wasn't just deformity. This was active change, bodies reshaping themselves with each step they took toward the woods. Every rational part of me screamed that animals don't just do that. Biology has rules, physics has laws, and what I was seeing violated all of them. The one with the most twisted leg was lagging behind the group, its back hunched at an odd angle, ribs pushing against its hide in a way that made me want to look away. I could see its spine through the fur, each vertebra distinct and wrongly spaced, creating a ridge of bone that undulated with movement. But I couldn't look away. It was almost as though it sensed how disturbed I was, because it paused for a moment, turned its head toward me, and let out a sound. It wasn't a typical deer noise, not the sharp bark of alarm or the gentle bleat of communication. It sounded warped, like a groan that buzzed through the air and left my stomach in knots. The sound had layers to it, harmonics that no animal throat should produce, creating a chord of wrongness that seemed to vibrate through the window glass and into my bones. My grip on the windowsill tightened until my knuckles ached. Splinters from the old wood dug into my palms, but the pain felt distant, unimportant compared to what I was witnessing. The rest of the deer didn't seem fazed by the monstrous shift happening among them. If anything, they seemed to embrace it, their bodies stretching and contorting with increasing fluidity as they moved. They continued to walk deeper into the trees, each limb bending at uncomfortable angles. Their legs weren't just bending wrong now, they were multiplying joints, adding segments that shouldn't exist. What had been a normal deer leg was becoming something arthropod-like. Too many bends, too much flexibility. And I swear their silhouettes elongated too, like something out of a nightmare. Slender forms fusing with the dim light filtering through the clouds. The lead doe's neck had stretched to nearly twice its original length, swaying like a snake as she walked. Her head still looked mostly normal, but the proportions were all wrong now, too small for the serpentine neck that supported it. When she turned to look back, directly at me, I was certain, her neck coiled in a way that made my stomach lurch. By the time they were half hidden by the trunks, I could barely recognize them as deer anymore. They were like outlines of something else, something not meant to be seen in daylight. Their forms seemed to blur at the edges, as if reality itself was having trouble maintaining their shapes. The trees around them looked sharper by comparison, more real, while the deer, or whatever they were becoming, seemed to exist in a slightly different layer of existence. The last one to disappear into the woods was the young buck with the impossible antlers. Just before the shadow swallowed him, he turned for one final look at the house. At me, his eyes had changed, no longer the dark brown of a normal deer. They glowed with a subtle luminescence, not bright enough to be called light, but definitely no longer adhering to the rules of normal sight. In that gaze I felt judgment, curiosity, and something else, an invitation perhaps, or a warning. I stood there in a haze, staring long after they disappeared. The yard looked normal again, just grass and trees, and the familiar view I'd grown accustomed to over the past months. But it felt tainted now, as if those creatures had left invisible tracks, psychic spoor that marked their passage. Every shadow seemed deeper, every movement of branch or leaf potentially hiding something impossible. For the rest of the day, I replayed the scene in my mind, convinced I'd gotten it all wrong. Maybe it was a trick of the sun, except the sun hadn't been shining. Maybe I was just tired, except I'd been well rested before this started. Yet every time logic tried to reassure me, I'd remember the way that leg bent, or how their necks stretched to impossible lengths, and my stomach churned all over again. I tried to distract myself with mundane tasks. I washed dishes that didn't need washing, organized closets that were already neat. Anything to keep my hands busy and my mind occupied. But my eyes kept drifting to the windows, checking and rechecking the yard for any sign of their return. The house felt smaller somehow, less like a shelter and more like an observation post, a thin barrier between me and whatever existed in those woods. That night, sleep was out of the question. I lay in bed with every light in the house blazing, creating a bubble of illumination that I hoped would keep the darkness at bay. Every noise outside made me jolt, the creak of old wood settling, the whisper of wind through leaves, the distant cry of what might have been an owl, but sounded too wrong to be certain. Even the slightest rustling of leaves had me picturing those distorted shapes lurking just beyond the yard. In my mind's eye, I saw them standing at the edge of the woods, their elongated forms swaying gently, watching the house with those wrong eyes. Waiting for something, waiting for me to make a mistake, to venture outside, to accept whatever invitation their presence implied. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see one of them press its elongated head against the glass. The image was so vivid, I could almost see the fog of its breath on the pane, the way its transformed features would distort through the glass. My brain wouldn't let me forget. The memory was too fresh, too vivid, burned into my consciousness like a brand. I started wondering if I should warn someone, call a game warden or a neighbor. But what would I say? The deer in my yard looked like something out of a horror movie? They'd think I was having a breakdown, seeing things, maybe sampling some of the local mushrooms that grew in the woods. Nobody would believe me. I wasn't sure I believed myself, but the terror was real. My hands were trembling every time I walked past that window. I'd installed heavy curtains years ago for privacy, but now I was grateful for their thickness, for the barrier they provided against whatever might be looking in. Still, not being able to see made it worse in some ways. My imagination filled in the gaps, creating scenarios where those things were right outside, inches from the glass, waiting for me to peek out. I couldn't bring myself to open the door, worried that if I stepped outside, I might come face to face with those twisted creatures, or whatever they were becoming. The thought of encountering them up close, of seeing the full extent of their transformation without the safety of glass between us, made my mouth go dry with fear. What if they were still changing? What if what I'd seen was just the beginning of something worse? Hours dragged by with agonizing slowness. I flicked on every light in the house, even the ones in rooms I wasn't using. The electric bill would be astronomical, but I didn't care. Light felt like safety, like a ward against whatever darkness those creatures carried with them. I convinced myself that staying in the dark was a bad idea, that shadows would give them places to hide, ways to get closer without being seen. My mind conjured images of those deer creeping closer while I slept, their limbs contorting further, their eyes glinting with some unnatural awareness. I kept imagining them trying to get in, pushing against the walls with those warped legs, slowly changing shape as they tried to squeeze through any possible opening. Every small sound became evidence of their approach. The tap of a branch against the roof became hooves, testing for weak spots. The settling of the foundation became bodies pressing against the walls. At one point, around 3 in the morning, I heard something that definitely wasn't my imagination. A sound like breathing but wrong, too deep, too rhythmic, coming from multiple sources at once. It seemed to emanate from all around the house, as if whatever was out there had surrounded me. I sat frozen in the living room, clutching a baseball bat I'd retrieved from the closet, knowing it would be useless against things that could reshape their own bodies. The breathing continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Sometimes it would sync up, all the sources breathing in unison, creating a sound like wind through a massive bellows. Other times it would fall out of rhythm, creating a chaotic chorus that made my head spin. I wanted to look outside, to confirm what I was hearing, but terror kept me rooted to the couch. By sunrise, I was mentally and physically exhausted. The breathing had stopped sometime before dawn, fading away so gradually I couldn't pinpoint when silence had returned. My eyes burned from staying awake, my muscles ached from tension, and my mind felt frayed at the edges from sustained fear. I mustered the courage to peek outside, pulling back the curtain just enough to see the yard. It was empty. Morning light flooded in, painting everything in soft, golden hues that made the previous night's terror seem almost dreamlike. For a second, I questioned whether I'd let my imagination run wild. The yard looked so normal, so peaceful, with dew glittering on the grass and birds beginning their morning songs. Still, a lingering dread hung in the air, an unshakable sense that something was fundamentally wrong with what I'd witnessed. This wasn't just a case of a lame deer or a small injury. It was an impossible transformation, a glimpse into something beyond normal comprehension. The world felt less stable now, as if discovering that the rules I'd always trusted could be bent or broken so easily. I ventured onto the porch that morning, bat still in hand, scanning the yard for any sign of their passage. The grass where they'd grazed looked normal, but I noticed something odd. The growth pattern was different, the blades bending in small spirals that reminded me uncomfortably of those twisted antlers. Whether this was new or I simply hadn't noticed before, I couldn't say. Near the tree line, I found tracks. They started as normal deer prints, but gradually became something else. The hoof marks stretched and multiplied, showing too many toes, too many joints, patterns that hurt to follow with my eyes. The trail led into the woods, but I didn't dare follow. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some questions better left unasked. Even now, weeks later, whenever I look outside, I have to brace myself. Part of me is sure I'll see those shapes again, drifting among the trees, limbs bending and stretching into unspeakable forms. Every deer that wanders into the yard gets a thorough inspection, my eyes tracking each movement of their legs, the angle of their necks, the shape of their antlers. So far, they've all been normal. So far. And a part of me wonders if one day they'll come back. Maybe this time, closer than before. Maybe next time they won't stop at the tree line. Maybe they'll come right up to the house. Those impossible forms pressing against the windows, those wrong eyes peering in, those layered voices calling out in harmonics that human ears were never meant to hear. The thought of it leaves me restless, scanning the yard with wary eyes, waiting for the slightest hint of movement that might confirm my worst fears. I've considered moving, returning to the city where the only wildlife is pigeons and rats, creatures bound by the normal rules of biology. But something keeps me here, perhaps stubbornness, perhaps the hope that what I saw was unique, a one-time glimpse behind reality's curtain, or perhaps it's something else. Sometimes, late at night when the darkness presses close and the woods seem to breathe with hidden life, I wonder if I'm staying because they want me to. Because whatever I witnessed that grey afternoon wasn't random, wasn't chance. It was a showing, a demonstration, a first contact with something that exists parallel to our world, but not quite within it. I've started leaving the lights on every night now. The electric bills don't matter anymore. What matters is maintaining this barrier of illumination, this small sphere of normalcy in a world that I now know contains impossible things. And every night, as I lie awake listening to the sounds of the woods, I wonder when they'll return. Because deep down, in the part of my mind that recognizes patterns and dangers, I know they will. The wrongness I witnessed wasn't passing through. It lives here in these woods, in this place where reality grows thin. And they know I saw them. They know I'm watching. They know I'm waiting, just as they are. I drove into Mendocino National Forest on a Tuesday afternoon in late September 2022, feeling both eager and oddly restless. Usually I get a burst of energy the moment I hit winding roads and thick woods, but something was off this time. The forest just seemed too quiet, not the peaceful, sleepy silence you might expect on a late afternoon, but a heavier stillness that lingered in the air. Daring me to press on, Yuri, my German Shepherd mix, was panting in the back seat, her massive head resting on the window ledge. She's been my companion on countless backcountry trips over the past 4 years, so I rely on her to sense if anything's wrong. Her instincts have saved me from aggressive wildlife encounters more times than I care to count. Up until now, she'd seemed perfectly content. But as we climbed higher into the mountains, her breathing became more labored, more anxious. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half hoping she'd offer some reassuring sign that everything was normal. Each time I looked, though, she was just watching. Her amber eyes tracked the tree line with an intensity that made my stomach clench. Her ears flicked back and forth, rotating like satellite dishes, as if she was listening for something I couldn't hear. The muscles along her neck stood taut, and occasionally she'd let out these barely audible whimpers that set my teeth on edge. The dirt road climbed higher, becoming bumpier with each turn. My Honda Accord wasn't built for this terrain, and I could feel the undercarriage scraping against jutting rocks with sickening metal-on-stone sounds. My tires crunched over loose gravel and patches of decomposing leaves that released a sour, fermented smell when disturbed. I caught myself easing off the gas, not wanting to go too deep into a place that had my nerves jumping like live wires. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees since we'd left the main highway, and shadows were lengthening between the towering pines and redwoods. What should have been dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy instead felt like fingers of darkness, reaching down to probe the forest floor. Every tree seemed to lean inward, creating a tunnel effect that made the world feel smaller, more compressed, more suffocating with each mile. I tried to brush off the growing unease. Maybe I was just spooked by how isolated this route was. Usually I crave solitude. I'd planned this trip precisely because I was tired of crowded campsites and wanted somewhere remote where Yuri could run free. Yet every foot forward stirred a growing knot of dread in my gut, like swallowing broken glass. I decided to pull over when I saw a small clearing on the edge of a bluff. It was a decent spot to stretch my legs and give Yuri a chance to sniff around. The view should have been stunning, a sprawling valley with dark green treetops stretching out like an endless sea. But I felt unsettled enough that I couldn't properly appreciate it. The vista seemed wrong somehow, too uniform, too still. Not a single bird crossed the sky, and there was no movement in the canopy below, not even the slightest breeze disturbing the leaves. My phone had just enough reception to send one last text to my boyfriend, Marcus. Feels strange out here. Might head back early. His response came through fragmented. Maybe something lurking. Woods, haha. Under normal circumstances, I'd have laughed it off, but his words hung in my mind longer than they should have, taking root like thorns. I climbed out of the car and immediately regretted it. The air hit me like a wall, thick, stagnant, carrying an undertone of decay that seemed out of place for this kind of forest. It wasn't the clean smell of decomposing leaves and rich earth I was used to. This was something else, something that made my nostrils burn and my throat constrict. Yuri hopped after me, but instead of her usual eager exploration, she stayed pressed against my legs, trembling. That's when I noticed the squirrel's body near the dirt road. At first, I figured it must have been run over by some passing vehicle, but the road was empty and barely more than a narrow path. The creature lay twisted at an unnatural angle. Its tiny limbs splayed in ways that suggested violence rather than accident. Its fur was matted with something dark and sticky, and when I looked closer, I saw that its eyes were missing, not pecked out by scavengers, but carved out with surgical precision. The sight of broken glass glittering around the carcass was equally jarring. The shards poked through the dirt like jagged teeth, reflecting the dying sunlight in tiny, blinding pinpricks. It had me wondering who would bother hauling bottles this far into the woods, only to smash them around a dead animal. The pattern seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic, arranged in a rough circle that made my skin crawl. Yuri let out a low rumble, one I'd almost call a growl. She usually reserves that sound for encounters with aggressive dogs or dangerous wildlife, never for random debris by the roadside. Her hackles rose along her spine like a mohawk of terror, and she began backing toward the car, her eyes never leaving the tree line. My chest clenched at her reaction. I knelt down and ran a hand along her back to calm her, but her muscles were rigid as steel cables beneath her thick coat. She made direct eye contact with me, something she rarely did unless she was trying to communicate urgent information. Her expression was unmistakable. We don't belong here, and we need to leave now. Determined not to overreact, I exhaled slowly and got back into the driver's seat. With every bump of the road as I continued uphill, I kept telling myself that weird vibes happen sometimes. Solitude can play tricks on people's minds. The stillness of the forest, the lack of traffic, the abandoned glass. Maybe it was nothing more than unfortunate coincidences. But even as I tried to rationalize, more unsettling details came into focus. I saw other animal remains scattered along the roadside like grotesque breadcrumbs. Small creatures, birds, rodents, what looked like parts of a young fox, splayed out in ways that made my stomach tighten and bile rise in my throat. Granted, wildlife perishes out here naturally, but never quite so frequently along a single, seldom-used road. The deeper I went, the more frequent they became, and the more deliberately arranged they appeared. Each carcass was positioned with its head pointing toward the road, as if they were meant to be seen by passing travelers. Their wounds were too clean, too precise to be natural. Something had been using tools, sharp tools, on these animals. The realization sent ice water through my veins. That was when I first heard the voices. Faint murmurs, distinctly male, drifting through the trees like smoke. They weren't shouting or calling out. The tone sounded conversational, almost casual, but I couldn't make out any real words. It was like listening to people talking in the next room of a house with thin walls. You know they're there, you can hear the rhythm of speech, but the content remains just out of reach. My heart started to pound so fiercely it felt like it might burst through my ribcage. Yuri perked up, ears drawn tall and forward, her entire body going rigid with attention. She was hearing it too, which meant I wasn't losing my mind. At least, not yet. The voices faded as quickly as they'd arrived, replaced by that oppressive stillness again. I sat there in my idling car, torn between pushing forward and turning back. Part of me, the stubborn part that had gotten me into trouble before, wanted to investigate. But a larger part, the part connected to every primal survival instinct my ancestors had passed down, was screaming at me to flee. I compromised by continuing another mile or so, telling myself I'd find a good camping spot and everything would feel normal again. But the voices returned, closer this time, emerging from different directions in the forest. Sometimes they seemed to come from my left, sometimes my right, sometimes from directly ahead. The acoustics were impossible. Voices don't travel that way in dense woods unless the speakers are deliberately moving around, coordinating their positions to confuse listeners. My pulse throbbed at every twist in the road. The conversations would start up suddenly, carry on for a few minutes, in that same indecipherable murmur, then cut off mid-sentence. The abrupt endings were the worst part. No trailing off, no natural conclusion, just instant silence that felt like a held breath. It suggested the speakers were stopping because they'd noticed me, because they were listening for my response. Finally, I reached a decision point. The road split ahead, one fork continuing up the mountain, the other circling back toward the main highway. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. Yuri had begun panting heavily, that stress panting dogs do when they're terrified, her tongue lolling out as she drooled all over my upholstery. I chose retreat. Every instinct I possessed was telling me to get out while I still could. I turned toward the highway fork, feeling a mixture of relief and shame. Part of me hated appearing weak, but a larger part recognized that bravery and stupidity often wear the same mask. As I began the descent, I caught movement in my rearview mirror, a flash of pale skin between the dark trunks. There 1 second and gone the next. The voices resumed behind me, growing fainter as I put distance between myself and whatever gathering was taking place in those woods. But even as they faded, I could swear I heard laughter mixed in with the conversation. Not pleasant laughter, the kind that comes after someone tells a cruel joke, sharp and mirthless. I spent that night in a cheap motel in Ukiah, but rest proved impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those mutilated animals, heard those disembodied voices. Yuri paced the small room for hours, occasionally stopping to stare at the door, as if she expected something to come through it. Her anxiety fed my own, until we were both wound tight as piano wires. By morning, I'd made a decision that would haunt me. Instead of driving home like any reasonable person would, I convinced myself I needed answers. Maybe I'd stumbled onto some kind of illegal hunting operation. Maybe someone was using the remote location for activities they didn't want discovered. The rational part of my brain insisted there had to be a logical explanation for everything I'd witnessed. I drove back to Mendocino, this time bringing supplies, a heavy flashlight, a baseball bat, my father's old hunting knife. If I was going to investigate, I'd be prepared. Yuri seemed to sense our destination because her agitation increased as we neared the forest. By the time we reached the turnoff, she was whining constantly, a high-pitched keening that set my nerves on edge. The daylight made things look different, but not better. The dead animals were still there, but now I could see details I'd missed in the previous evening's fading light. The wounds weren't random, they followed patterns. Precise cuts, almost surgical in their execution. Someone with medical knowledge, or at least experience with anatomy, had been at work here. The broken glass formations were more elaborate than I'd initially realized. They formed symbols, crude but deliberate shapes that suggested meaning, purpose. I didn't recognize the patterns, but they reminded me of gang tags or ritual markings I'd seen in documentaries about cults. The thought made my mouth go dry. As I drove deeper into the forest, I discovered more evidence of human presence. Footprints in the soft earth, multiple sets suggesting a group of at least 4 or 5 people. Cigarette butts ground into the dirt. A piece of rope tied around a tree trunk, hanging loose like a noose that had been cut down. The road eventually opened onto a wider clearing I'd missed during my hasty retreat the day before. It was larger than a football field, ringed by towering pines that blocked most of the sky. In the center sat the remains of an old campfire, but this wasn't from casual campers. The fire pit was enormous, big enough to burn substantial amounts of material, and the ground around it was stained black in ways that suggested more than wood had been consumed. Scattered around the clearing were more animal remains, but these were different from the roadside specimens. These had been burned, partially consumed by fire, leaving behind blackened bones and charred flesh that filled the air with a sickening sweetness. The smell made me gag and cover my nose with my shirt, but it couldn't block out the stench entirely. Yuri refused to leave the car. When I opened her door, she pressed herself against the far window, shaking violently. I'd never seen her react this way to anything, not thunderstorms, not aggressive dogs, not even when we'd encountered a black bear on a trail in Yosemite. Whatever had happened in this clearing had left an impression that transcended normal animal instincts. I forced myself to examine the fire pit more closely. Mixed in with the ash and bone fragments were pieces of fabric. Some of it looked like clothing. I found a partially melted button, part of what might have been a shoe sole, and something that made my blood freeze, a human tooth. Cracked from heat, but unmistakably human. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just animal sacrifice or some weird hunting ritual. People had been here, and at least some of them hadn't left alive. The scope of what I was looking at, the evidence of violence, the deliberate disposal of remains, suggested something far worse than I'd imagined. That's when I heard vehicles approaching. Multiple engines moving slowly but steadily up the mountain road I'd just traveled. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized I was trapped. The clearing had only one entrance, and whoever was coming would see my car immediately. I grabbed Yuri and ran for the tree line, dragging her resistant form into the dense undergrowth. We crouched behind a fallen log, about 50 yards from the clearing's edge, hidden, but with a clear view of the open space. Yuri had stopped shaking but remained pressed against me, her breathing shallow and controlled, like she understood the need for silence. 3 pickup trucks rolled into the clearing, their engines rumbling to a stop near the fire pit. 6 men climbed out, all dressed in dark clothing, all carrying equipment I couldn't quite make out from our hiding spot. They moved with practiced efficiency, like they'd done this many times before. One of them, a tall, thin man with graying hair, seemed to be giving orders to the others. They began setting up what looked like a camp, but not the kind anyone would recognize from normal outdoor activities. They arranged folding chairs in a circle around the fire pit, positioned cameras on tripods at various angles, and laid out tools on a plastic tarp. Even from a distance, I could see knives, rope, and other implements that made my stomach clench with dread. The voices I'd been hearing started up again, but now I could see their source. The men talked casually among themselves as they worked, discussing their preparations like they were planning a barbecue rather than whatever horrific activity they were actually organizing. Their matter-of-fact tone was somehow more terrifying than screaming would have been. "Should be here soon," one of them said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Got the new ones loaded?" asked another. 3 this time. Fresh ones. The casual way they discussed fresh ones made my skin crawl. I realized with growing horror that I was witnessing the preparation for something unspeakable, something that probably happened regularly in this remote location. The animal remains, the human tooth, the burned clothing, it all pointed to systematic violence, to people who had turned this isolated clearing into their private hunting ground. But they weren't hunting animals. One of the men walked toward the edge of the clearing, scanning the tree line methodically. For a heart-stopping moment, his gaze seemed to linger on our hiding spot. Yuri pressed herself lower against the ground, instinctively understanding the danger. The man continued his survey, apparently satisfied that they were alone. I knew we had to move before their victims arrived, before whatever they were planning began. But getting back to my car without being seen would be nearly impossible. The men had positioned themselves with clear sight lines across most of the clearing, and my Honda was parked right in the open where anyone could spot it. Then I heard more vehicles approaching, different engines, multiple cars moving in convoy. My blood turned to ice as I realized these must be the fresh ones the men had discussed. More victims being brought to this remote killing ground, probably against their will. I was about to witness something that would haunt me forever. Something that would make me complicit through inaction. I had to make a choice, try to help whoever was coming, or save myself and Yuri while I still could. The logical part of my brain screamed that I was outnumbered, outgunned, and completely unprepared for confrontation with organized killers. But the human part of me rebelled against abandoning innocent people to whatever these monsters had planned. The decision was made for me when Yuri suddenly bolted. Something, a sound I hadn't heard, a scent that triggered her deepest instincts, sent her crashing through the underbrush toward the opposite side of the clearing. Her movement immediately drew attention from the men who shouted and pointed in our direction. "Someone's here!" One of them yelled. "Find them!" ordered the tall man with grey hair. I had no choice but to run. Abandoning any hope of stealth, I crashed through the forest, branches tearing at my clothes and face as I tried to keep up with Yuri's frantic flight. Behind us, I could hear heavy footsteps and shouted commands as the men organized a search. They knew these woods better than I did, but Yuri's panic gave us speed and direction. We reached my car just as the first searcher emerged from the tree line behind us. I yanked open the door. Yuri leaped inside, and I gunned the engine before my door was even closed. Gravel sprayed as I spun around, tires screaming for traction on the loose surface. In my rearview mirror, I saw two of the men running toward their trucks, preparing to give chase. But my head start and my desperation gave me the advantage I needed. I drove like my life depended on it, which it probably did, taking curves at speeds that made my car slide sideways and bounce off rocks that could have shattered my axles. By the time I reached the main highway, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. But we'd made it out. We were alive. The question that would torment me for months afterward was whether the people in those approaching vehicles had been as fortunate. I drove straight to the nearest police station and told them everything. They listened politely, took notes, and promised to investigate. But when I called a week later to follow up, they said they'd found no evidence of criminal activity in the area I'd described. The clearing was empty, they claimed. No fire pit, no remains, no sign that anyone had been there recently either. I'd imagined everything, which seemed impossible given Yuri's consistent reactions, or the people I'd encountered had cleaned up their operation and moved on. The thought that they might be setting up somewhere else, finding new victims, new isolated locations for their activities, still keeps me awake at night. I never went back to Mendocino National Forest. Some places, once they show you their true darkness, should be left alone. But sometimes, driving through other remote areas, I find myself listening for voices in the woods, watching for movements between the trees, and wondering how many other clearings like that one exist in the vast wilderness of our country. God help anyone who stumbles across them the way I did, and God help those who don't make it out. I remember the first day I realized how different my life was, not because of some grand adventure, but because of the small, significant moments that piled up to define my existence. It was a Tuesday, and I had just set out on my much-anticipated RV camping trip. I loved the freedom it gave me, a break from the monotony of everyday life. My name is Lucas Blackwood, and I'm known among my friends for my love of the outdoors. Though I faced more than my fair share of hardships, I decided to camp near the banks of the Shenandoah River, a serene spot known for its picturesque views and tranquil environment. The late spring air was crisp, filled with the scents of blooming flowers and freshly cut grass. My RV was parked in a small clearing, surrounded by tall oaks, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. By noon I had set up my campsite and was enjoying a simple lunch. The world seemed at peace, and so was I. I spent the afternoon fishing, catching a couple of sizable trout, which I planned to grill for dinner. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, I settled by the fire with a book in hand. It was around this time that I noticed a figure in the distance. At first, it was just a shadow moving among the trees. But as it drew closer, I saw it was a man, perhaps in his mid-30s, with a rugged look and an intense expression. He approached my campsite cautiously, his eyes scanning the area as if looking for something or someone. "Evening," I called out, trying to sound friendly. "Beautiful spot, isn't it?" He nodded but didn't respond. His silence was unnerving. He wore a worn-out jacket and heavy boots, which suggested he had been traveling through the woods for some time. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "I'm looking for my brother," he finally said, his voice rough. "We got separated a couple of days ago. I haven't seen anyone else around here," I replied. "You sure he's in this area?" He nodded again. "Yeah, he's around here somewhere. Name's Daniel. If you see him, let him know Owen's looking for him." I agreed to keep an eye out and offered him some food and water, which he declined before disappearing back into the woods. His visit left me uneasy, but I shrugged it off. People got lost in the woods all the time. It wasn't unusual for them to ask for help. As night fell, I retreated into my RV, locking the doors behind me. I was ready for a good night's sleep after the long day, but sleep wouldn't come easily. I kept hearing noises, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, though I told myself it was just the wildlife. Around midnight, I heard a distinct knock on my RV door. My heart pounded as I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously approached the door. "Who's there?" "It's me, Owen. I think I found him." I opened the door slightly, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Owen's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "What's wrong?" "Come with me. You'd need to see this." I grabbed my jacket and followed him into the woods. We walked in silence, the only sound being the crunch of leaves under our boots. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a small clearing. Owen pointed to the ground, and my blood ran cold. There, lying face down in the dirt, was a body. I knelt down, my hands trembling as I checked for a pulse. There was none. The man was dead, his face battered and unrecognizable. "Daniel?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Owen nodded. "What happened to him?" "I don't know." "I found him like this," he replied, his voice breaking. "We need to call the authorities." We made our way back to my RV, and I dialed 911 with shaking hands. The dispatcher's calm voice was a stark contrast to the panic I felt. They gave them our location and explained the situation. They assured me that help was on the way. As we waited, Owen and I sat in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on us. The minutes felt like hours. Finally, we saw the flashing lights of the police cars approaching. The officers took our statements and secured the scene, treating it as a potential crime. The rest of the night was a blur of questions and flashing cameras. I felt like I was living someone else's nightmare. By dawn, they had identified the body as Daniel, confirming Owen's worst fears. The police suspected foul play and began their investigation in earnest. Owen was taken in for further questioning, and I was allowed to stay at a nearby motel, my RV now part of a crime scene. The sense of peace I had felt just 24 hours earlier was shattered, replaced by an uneasy feeling that this was far from over. In the following days, the investigation unfolded like a twisted puzzle. It turned out that Owen and Daniel had been involved in some illegal activities, something I had not expected. They were part of a smuggling ring, using the dense woods and secluded campsites as their routes. Daniel's death was likely a message from their associates, a warning to Owen. I kept my distance from the investigation, but the details trickled in through the news and occasional visits from the detectives. I learned that the smuggling ring was more extensive than anyone had realized, involving not just drugs, but also weapons and other illicit goods. The authorities were cracking down hard, using Daniel's murder as leverage to dismantle the operation. One evening, about a week after the incident, I was packing up my things to head home when I received an unexpected visitor. Detective Harris, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a steely demeanor, knocked on my motel room door. "Mr. Blackwood, we need to talk," she said, flashing her badge. "Of course, Detective. What's this about?" "We have reason to believe that you might be in danger," she said, her tone grave. "Owen has been cooperating with us, and his associates might not take kindly to that. They might see you as a loose end." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you suggest I do?" "We're offering you protection, but we also need your help. We believe Owen's brother's murder is just the tip of the iceberg. If you're willing to assist us, we can ensure your safety." It was a lot to take in. I'd come here for a peaceful camping trip, and now found myself entangled in a criminal investigation. But there was no other choice. I agreed to cooperate, knowing it was the only way to stay safe and perhaps make a difference. Over the next few weeks, I worked closely with Detective Harris and her team. They used me as bait, setting up another camping trip to lure the smugglers out. The operation was risky, but it was our best shot at catching them in the act. I found myself back in the woods, this time with a team of undercover officers nearby. The tension was palpable as we waited for the smugglers to take the bait. Hours passed with no sign of them, and I began to wonder if they had seen through our plan. Just as I was about to call it a night, I heard the familiar rustling of leaves. My heart raced as I signaled to the officers, who moved silently into position. A group of men emerged from the trees, their faces hard and eyes filled with malice. They were heavily armed, and it was clear they meant business. "Where's Owen?" one of them demanded. "He's not here," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Wrong answer," the leader snarled. Raising his weapon, before he could pull the trigger, the woods exploded with activity. The undercover officers sprang into action, taking the smugglers by surprise. Gunfire echoed through the trees, and I ducked for cover behind a fallen log. The firefight was intense, but the officers had the upper hand, thanks to their preparation and numbers. When the dust settled, the smugglers were subdued, and the officers quickly secured the area. I emerged from my hiding spot shaken but unharmed. Detective Harris approached me, a look of relief on her face. "You did well, Lucas. We got them," she said, patting my shoulder. The operation was a success. The smugglers were arrested, and their operation dismantled. Owen, in exchange for his cooperation, entered witness protection, hoping to start a new life far from the shadows of his past. As for me, I returned to my RV, the peaceful campsite, now a stark reminder of the chaos that had unfolded. I packed up my things, ready to leave the woods behind. The tranquility I once sought here was forever tainted by the memories of that night, but life goes on. I resumed my routine, though with a newfound appreciation for the ordinary moments. The experience had changed me, but not in the way one might expect. I wasn't haunted by nightmares or overwhelmed by fear. Instead, I felt a sense of resilience, a determination to live fully despite the darkness I had witnessed. As I drove away from the Shenandoah River, I glanced in the rearview mirror, the tall oaks receding into the distance. The woods held many secrets, some of which I had uncovered, and while I couldn't forget what happened, I refused to let it define me. Yet as the miles rolled by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. In the shadows of the trees lining the road, I swore I saw figures moving, keeping pace with my RV. And in the quiet moments, when the engine's hum faded into the background, I could hear whispers carried on the wind. Speaking of unfinished business and debts yet to be paid, I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. The horror I thought I'd left behind in those woods was far from over. It had merely changed form, becoming a shadow that clung to me, a presence that waited in the corners of my vision, biding its time. As night fell and the road stretched endlessly before me, I realized that my journey into darkness had only just begun. The woods may have held secrets, but the real terror was what I had brought out with me, a knowledge that there were things in this world far more sinister than I had ever imagined. And they now knew my name. The horror story of my life wasn't ending. It was evolving, growing, spreading its tendrils into every aspect of my existence. And as I drove on into the night, I couldn't help but wonder, when would the next chapter begin, and what nightmares would it bring? It's funny how I ended up here, in the middle of nowhere, doing something I swore I'd never do. You see, I've always been more of a city guy, the kind who enjoys the hum of traffic, the glow of streetlights, and the comfort of knowing a bodega is just around the corner. My name is Arthur Malvin, and I was an investment banker, a workaholic who never took a break until I was forced to. The heart attack wasn't severe, but it was enough to make my doctor insist on time away from the office. It happened on a Tuesday, right in the middle of a high-stakes meeting with some of our biggest clients. One minute I was confidently outlining our strategy for their portfolio, the next I was clutching my chest, gasping for air as the room spun around me. I remember the looks of shock and concern on my colleagues' faces as I was whisked away in an ambulance, sirens blaring. The hospital was a blur of white walls, beeping machines, and stern-faced doctors. When the dust settled, and I found myself lying in a hospital bed with wires attached to my chest, my doctor didn't mince words. "Mr. Malvin," he said, peering at me over his glasses, "if you don't make some serious lifestyle changes, you won't live to see your next bonus." It was a wake-up call, to say the least. My wife, Sarah, who had rushed to the hospital as soon as she heard, sat by my bedside, her face a mixture of relief and worry. She'd been telling me to slow down for years, but I never listened. Always another deal to close, another client to impress. "Arthur," she said, squeezing my hand, "maybe it's time we took that break we've been talking about." I nodded, too weak and shocked to argue. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of recovery, soul-searching, and much to my chagrin, research into relaxing activities. It was my daughter, Emily, who suggested camping. "Dad, you need to disconnect," she said one evening as we sat around the dinner table. "Like really disconnect. No phone, no internet, just you and nature." I scoffed at first. "Me camping?" The last time I'd been in a tent was at a corporate retreat 5 years ago, and I'd hated every minute of it. But as the days went by, and I felt the pressure from both my family and my doctor to do something drastic, the idea started to take root. So, after some more soul-searching and pressure from my family, I found myself at an RV dealership, staring at what would become my home for the next few weeks. It was a behemoth of a vehicle, all shiny white exterior and promise of luxury on wheels. The salesman, a portly fellow named Bob with a penchant for Hawaiian shirts, was practically salivating as he showed me around. "This baby's got everything you need. Mr. Malvin," he said, patting the side of the RV. "Full kitchen, bathroom with a shower, queen-size bed, and even a little office nook if you need to do some work." I winced at the mention of work, remembering my doctor's stern warning. "No work," I said firmly. "This is supposed to be about relaxation." Bob nodded enthusiastically. Of course. Then let me show you the entertainment system. We've got satellite TV, a great sound system." I held up a hand to stop him. "Actually, I think I'll pass on all that. Just the basics, please." Bob looked at me like I'd grown a second head, but he shrugged and adjusted his pitch. An hour later, I was the proud owner of a slightly more modest RV, equipped with the necessities but blessedly free of any high-tech distractions. As I drove the RV home, carefully navigating the busy streets of New York, I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and trepidation. This was so far out of my comfort zone, it might as well have been on another planet. But maybe that was exactly what I needed. Sarah was waiting for me when I pulled up in front of our brownstone, her eyes wide as she took in the size of the vehicle. "Oh, Arthur," she said, a hint of amusement in her voice. "When you commit to something, you really commit, don't you?" I chuckled, some of my nervousness dissipating at her reaction. Go big or go home, right? We spent the next few days preparing for my trip. Sarah and Emily helped me pack, filling the RV with everything from hiking boots, brand new and uncomfortably stiff, to insect repellent, industrial strength at Emily's insistence. My son Michael, who was away at college, sent me a care package full of energy bars and a survival guide, along with a note that read, "Try not to get eaten by bears. Dad." The night before I was set to leave, we had a family dinner. The mood was a mix of excitement and concern, with Sarah fussing over last-minute details and the kids peppering me with advice. "Remember, Dad," Emily said seriously, "if you see a bear, you're supposed to make yourself look big and make noise." "I think that's for mountain lions," Michael countered. "For bears, you're supposed to play dead." "Either way," I said, taking a sip of my decaf coffee, another concession to my new lifestyle. "Let's hope I don't have to put either strategy to the test." As we cleared the dishes, Sarah pulled me aside. "Are you sure about this, Arthur?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. "It's a big change. Maybe I should come with you, at least for the first few days." I shook my head, touched by her concern, but determined to do this on my own. "I need to do this myself, Sarah. Doctor's orders, remember?" Complete disconnect. She nodded, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "Just be careful, okay? And call me when you can." The next morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect day for starting an adventure. As I loaded the last of my gear into the RV, my family gathered on the sidewalk to see me off. There were hugs all around, last-minute advice, and more than a few teary eyes, mostly from Sarah, though I'll admit to feeling a bit misty myself. As I climbed into the driver's seat, Emily called out, "Don't forget to have fun, Dad." I waved, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb, watching my family grow smaller in the rearview mirror. The streets of New York gave way to highways, then to smaller roads as I made my way out of the city and into the countryside. As the landscape changed around me, becoming greener and less populated, I felt a strange mix of anxiety and excitement. I was heading into the unknown, leaving behind the world I knew so well. But maybe, just maybe, this was exactly what I needed. Little did I know, as I drove towards the distant mountains, just how much this trip would change me and the incredible, terrifying adventures that awaited me in the wilderness. The drive to West Virginia was a journey in itself. As I navigated the RV along highways and then increasingly narrow roads, I watched the landscape transform around me. The towering skyscrapers of New York gave way to rolling hills, then to the rugged terrain of the Appalachian Mountains. It was like watching the pages of a nature magazine come to life before my eyes. I had chosen the Monongahela National Forest as my destination, a name I had stumbled upon during my hasty research and could barely pronounce. As I approached the forest, the roads became windier, the trees grew denser, and signs of civilization became fewer and far between. My GPS signal started to falter, and I found myself relying on good old-fashioned paper maps, something I hadn't done since I was a kid on family road trips. It was late afternoon when I finally reached the entrance to the forest. A wooden sign welcomed me to Monongahela National Forest. Its paint faded and chipped, adding to the sense that I was entering a place where time moved differently. I pulled over at the ranger station, a small log cabin-style building that seemed to blend into the surrounding forest. The ranger, a weathered man in his 50s with a salt and pepper beard, raised an eyebrow when I stepped out of the RV in my crisp khakis and polo shirt. "First time camping?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. I nodded, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "That obvious, huh?" He chuckled, but his eyes were kind. "We all start somewhere. Name's Tom. Let's get you set up with a map and some safety guidelines." Tom spent the next half hour going over the basics with me. How to read the trail markers, what to do if I encountered wildlife, and the importance of leaving no trace. He pointed out a few good spots for RV camping on the map. But when I mentioned I was looking for something more secluded, he hesitated. "There's a spot near Spruce Knob Lake," he said, circling an area on the map. "It's off the beaten path, not many folks go out there. But it's beautiful country. Just be careful, all right? Nature can be unforgiving if you're not prepared." I thanked Tom for his help and set off, following his directions down a narrow, winding road that took me deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to grow taller and closer together as I drove, their branches forming a canopy overhead that filtered the late afternoon sunlight into a soft, green glow. After about an hour of careful driving, I finally reached the spot Tom had marked on the map. It was a small clearing near a babbling stream, far enough from the main road that I couldn't hear any traffic. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the gentle gurgle of the stream. I parked the RV, feeling a sense of accomplishment at having made it this far. As I stepped out, the rich scent of pine and damp earth filled my nostrils. The air was crisp and clean, so different from the city air I was used to. For a moment, I just stood there, taking it all in. Then reality set in. I needed to set up camp. The next hour was a comedy of errors as I fumbled with unfamiliar equipment. Setting up the awning on the RV proved to be a Herculean task, and by the time I managed to get it extended, I was sweating and my polo shirt was smudged with dirt. Starting a fire was another challenge. Despite having watched countless YouTube videos on the subject, my first attempts resulted in nothing more than smoldering twigs and wounded pride. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, I finally managed to get a respectable fire going. Feeling quite proud of myself, I decided to try my hand at fishing in the stream. I had packed a collapsible fishing rod, another purchase made in the spirit of embracing nature. I made my way down to the stream, the sound of running water growing louder as I approached. The water was clear and cold, and I could see small fish darting about in the shallows. With more confidence than skill, I cast my line into a deeper pool. An hour later, I trudged back to the RV, no fish in hand, but my pants soaked from an unfortunate slip on a mossy rock. So much for living off the land, I muttered to myself, reaching for a can of beans from my supplies. As I sat by the fire, eating my less-than-gourmet dinner, I watched the sky darken and the stars emerge. Without the light pollution of the city, the night sky was a spectacle I had almost forgotten existed. Thousands of stars twinkled overhead, and for the first time in years, I could clearly see the Milky Way stretching across the sky. It was beautiful, awe-inspiring even, but as the fire died down and the darkness of the forest pressed in around me, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The forest, which had seemed merely quiet during the day, now felt oppressively silent. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves made me jump, my imagination conjuring images of bears or mountain lions lurking just beyond the circle of firelight. I tried to shake off the feeling, reminding myself that this was what I had come for, to experience nature in all its raw beauty. But as I doused the fire and retreated into the RV for the night, I made sure to lock the door securely behind me. Inside the RV, I settled into the unfamiliar bed, the silence of the forest a stark contrast to the constant background noise of the city I was used to. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder if I had made a mistake. Was I really cut out for this? Could a lifelong city dweller like me truly find peace in the wilderness? With these thoughts swirling in my mind, I eventually drifted off into an uneasy sleep, unaware that my true adventure in the Monongahela National Forest was only just beginning. I woke the next morning to a cacophony of birdsong. For a moment, I was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings of the RV confusing my sleep-addled brain. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back, and I remembered where I was, in the middle of the Monongahela National Forest, miles from civilization. Rubbing the sleep from my eyes, I peered out the window. The clearing was bathed in the soft light of early morning, mist rising from the stream and curling around the bases of the trees. It was a scene of such tranquil beauty that for a moment all my doubts and fears from the night before seemed silly. I stepped outside, inhaling deeply. The air was crisp and cool, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. A deer was drinking from the stream, its head snapping up at my appearance. We regarded each other for a moment before it bounded off into the underbrush, white tail flashing. "Well, Arthur," I said to myself, "you wanted to experience nature. Here it is." After a breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, I made a mental note to bring better provisions next time. Assuming there would be a next time, I decided to explore the area around my campsite. I had packed a small backpack with water, some energy bars, and a first aid kit, trying to remember all the advice from the hiking websites I'd frantically read before the trip. The trail I chose was barely visible, more of a game path than anything made for human feet. It wound through the dense forest, occasionally offering glimpses of the stream as it tumbled over rocks and fallen logs. The going was tougher than I had anticipated. My new hiking boots, barely broken in, began to rub uncomfortably at my heels, and I was quickly out of breath. Years of sitting behind a desk had not prepared me for this kind of physical exertion. But as I pushed on, I found myself becoming more attuned to the forest around me. I noticed things I might have overlooked before. The intricate patterns of lichen on tree trunks, the darting flight of a woodpecker, the subtle variations in the greens of the foliage. It was like my senses, dulled by years in the city, were slowly reawakening. After about an hour of hiking, I came across a small waterfall cascading into a clear pool. The sight was so picturesque that I half expected to see a nymph bathing in the waters. I sat on a mossy rock, catching my breath and drinking in the scene. For the first time since my heart attack, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. As I sat there, I found my thoughts drifting to my life back in the city. The constant pressure, the endless meetings, the late nights at the office, it all seemed so distant now, almost like a dream. Had I really been so caught up in that world that I'd forgotten places like this existed? A rustling in the underbrush snapped me out of my reverie. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it might be a bear, but then a raccoon emerged, regarding me with curious eyes before scampering off. I chuckled at my own jumpiness, but the encounter reminded me that I was in wild country now, and I needed to stay alert. I decided to head back to the campsite, my muscles protesting as I stood up. The hike back seemed longer, and I was relieved when I finally caught sight of the RV through the trees. As I approached the clearing, however, I noticed something was amiss. The awning I had struggled so hard to set up was collapsed on one side, and there were distinct paw prints in the soft earth around the RV. My heart racing, I approached cautiously, scanning the area for any sign of the animal that had visited in my absence. There was no sign of it now, but the evidence of its presence was clear. Cautiously, I circled the RV, looking for any damage. The awning was easily fixed, but what worried me more were the deep scratches on the side of the vehicle, just below the window. Whatever had been here was large and potentially dangerous. "Okay, Arthur," I muttered to myself, trying to calm my racing heart. "Remember what the ranger said. Stay calm, make noise, look big." I clapped my hands loudly and shouted, "Hey! Anyone there?" Feeling slightly ridiculous, but determined to scare off any lingering wildlife. The forest remained silent, save for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Satisfied that the immediate area was clear, I quickly repaired the awning and went inside the RV, locking the door behind me. As I sat at the small table, my hands shaking slightly as I poured myself a glass of water, I couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and exhilaration. This was real wilderness, not the sanitized version I'd seen in nature documentaries. It was beautiful, yes, but also dangerous and unpredictable. As evening approached, I debated whether to build another fire. On one hand, the warmth and light would be comforting. On the other, I wasn't sure if it would attract more animals. In the end, my city dwellers' need for light won out, and I set about gathering wood, making much more noise than necessary as I did so. The fire crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows across the clearing. I warmed up some canned soup, missing Sarah's home cooking more than ever. As I ate, I found myself straining to identify every little sound from the forest around me. Was that just the wind, or something moving through the underbrush? Was that distant howl a wolf or just my imagination? Despite my nervousness, there was something undeniably thrilling about the situation. Here I was, Arthur Malvin, former workaholic investment banker, sitting alone in the wilderness, fending for myself. If my colleagues could see me now, they'd never believe it. As the night wore on, my eyelids grew heavy. The events of the day, coupled with my lingering jet lag, were catching up with me. I doused the fire carefully, remembering the ranger's warnings about forest fires, and retreated to the safety of the RV. Sleep, however, proved elusive. Every creak of the RV settling, every rustle of leaves outside had me wide awake, ears straining for signs of danger. It was during one of these wakeful moments, somewhere in the small hours of the morning, that I heard it. A rustling sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from the trees. At first, I dismissed it as a deer or some other harmless creature, but the sound grew closer, heavier, like something large was moving through the underbrush. My heart pounding, I grabbed the flashlight I'd placed by the bed and shone it out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and shadows, but I couldn't see anything moving. The rustling had stopped. I waited, hardly daring to breathe, but the forest remained silent, eventually convinced that the danger, if there had been any, had passed. I managed to fall into a fitful sleep. My dreams were filled with shadowy creatures and endless twisting forest paths. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the horrors of the night seeming far away in the cheerful light of day. I emerged from the RV, stretching muscles sore from yesterday's hike, and surveyed the campsite. There were no new signs of animal visitors, and I began to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. Over a breakfast of instant coffee and granola bars, I pondered my plans for the day. Part of me was tempted to pack up and head back to civilization, to chalk this up as an interesting experiment and return to the comforts of city life. But a growing part of me was intrigued by the forest and its mysteries. I'd come here to challenge myself, hadn't I? To step out of my comfort zone? Decision made, I packed a day bag with supplies and set out to explore further into the forest. This time, I was better prepared with broken-in boots, a detailed map, and a fully charged GPS device, although the signal out here was spotty at best. I chose a different trail this time, one that led away from the stream and deeper into the woods. The path was overgrown in places, clearly not frequently used, which only added to its appeal. As I hiked, I found myself becoming more comfortable with the sounds and rhythms of the forest. The crack of a twig underfoot no longer sent my heart racing, and I started to distinguish between the calls of different birds. After about 2 hours of steady hiking, the trail began to slope upward. The incline was gentle at first, but grew steeper as I continued. My legs burned with the effort, and I was breathing heavily, but I pressed on, driven by a curiosity I couldn't quite explain. Just as I was considering turning back, the trail crested a small ridge, and I found myself looking down into a hidden clearing. It was a perfect circle, as if the trees had been purposely planted to create this secret space. In the center of the clearing was a stone structure, low to the ground and covered in moss. It looked ancient, like something out of a history book, maybe a forgotten altar or shrine. Intrigued, I made my way down into the clearing. As I approached the stone structure, I noticed strange carvings on the stones, symbols I didn't recognize, etched deeply into the rock. They seemed to shimmer slightly in the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees, creating an almost hypnotic effect. I reached out to touch one of the symbols, feeling the roughness of the stone under my fingers. As I did, a sudden chill ran down my spine, despite the warmth of the day. I had the distinct feeling that I was being watched. I spun around, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing at the edge of the clearing. But there was nothing there, just the silent trees surrounding the clearing like sentinels. And then I heard it. The rustling. Only this time, it was accompanied by a low, rhythmic thumping, like something heavy hitting the ground repeatedly. It was the same sound I had heard last night, only much closer now. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The thumping grew louder, seeming to come from all around me. The trees at the edge of the clearing seemed to shimmer and waver, as if I was looking at them through heat haze. And then, emerging from between two ancient oaks, I saw it. A hulking figure covered in coarse matted fur, standing on two legs like a man, but with a face that was all wrong. It was like a wolf, but its features were distorted, stretched and twisted into something grotesque. Its eyes, God, those eyes were wide and wild, reflecting the sunlight as it stepped into the clearing. I stood frozen, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't exist outside of horror movies and campfire tales. But the creature was undeniably there, its hot, rancid breath visible in the cool air of the clearing. It snarled, a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the clearing and snapped me out of my paralysis. I knew I couldn't fight it, not with just the small hunting knife I had brought for protection. But there was nowhere to run. The creature was between me and the trail, and the clearing was surrounded by dense undergrowth. In that moment, as the creature tensed to spring, time seemed to slow down. I saw my life flash before my eyes. Sarah, the kids, my office in New York. Was this how it was going to end? Arthur Malvin, killed by a mythical beast in the woods of West Virginia? The creature lunged, moving with terrifying speed for something so large. I barely had time to react, diving to the side and rolling across the forest floor. I scrambled to my feet, leaves and twigs clinging to my clothes, and ran for the stone structure in the center of the clearing. It was low, but it was the only cover available. I vaulted over the stone altar, feeling a rush of air as the creature's claws barely missed my back. I hit the ground hard on the other side, the breath knocked out of me. Gasping, I turned to see the creature circling the altar, its eyes never leaving me. My hand scrabbled in the leaf litter beside me, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My fingers closed around a sturdy branch, and I gripped it tightly, knowing it would do little against the creature, but unwilling to go down without a fight. The creature growled, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very ground, and tensed for another attack. In that moment, as I prepared to face what I was sure would be my doom, my eyes fell on one of the carved symbols on the altar. It was glowing faintly, pulsing in time with my rapid heartbeat. Acting on pure instinct, I pressed my hand against the symbol. The stone was warm to the touch, almost vibrating with energy. As my palm made contact, a blinding light erupted from the altar, bathing the clearing in an unearthly glow. The creature howled, a sound of pain and fury that made my ears ring. It backed away, shielding its eyes from the light. The glow intensified, forcing me to squint against its brilliance. When it finally faded, I opened my eyes to find the clearing empty. The creature was gone. I stood there, panting, my mind reeling from what had just happened. The clearing was silent now, the only sound my own ragged breathing. The symbol on the altar had stopped glowing, looking once again like nothing more than an ancient carving. On shaky legs, I made my way back to the trail, constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting the creature to reappear. The hike back to my campsite was a blur, my mind still trying to process what I had seen and experienced. As I stumbled into the familiar clearing where my RV was parked, the normality of it all seemed surreal. How could I go back to my ordinary life after what I had just witnessed? And more importantly, what was I going to do now? I spent a restless night in the RV, jumping at every sound and barely sleeping. By the time dawn broke, I had made a decision. I couldn't just leave, not with what I had seen. There were questions that needed answering, mysteries that needed solving. The old Arthur Malvin might have run away, might have convinced himself it was all a stress-induced hallucination. But I wasn't that person anymore. After a hasty breakfast, I packed a bag with supplies for a longer expedition: food, water, first aid kit, and my trusty hunting knife. I also brought along a notebook and pen, determined to document everything I found. As an afterthought, I grabbed the glossy brochure about local wildlife that the ranger had given me. Somehow I doubted it would have a section on wolf-like creatures that walked on two legs, but it couldn't hurt to be prepared. The hike back to the hidden clearing took less time now that I knew the way. Every rustle in the undergrowth made me tense, but the forest seemed peaceful in the morning light. Birds chirped, squirrels chattered, and a gentle breeze rustled through the leaves. It was hard to believe that just yesterday, this same forest had been the setting for a terrifying encounter with an impossible creature. When I reached the clearing, I half expected it to be gone, to have vanished like a mirage. But it was there, just as I remembered it. The stone altar stood in the center, its carved symbols clear in the morning light. There was no sign of the creature, no tracks or fur or anything to prove that it had been real. I approached the altar cautiously, my eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. When I reached it, I examined the symbols more closely. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before. Not quite hieroglyphics, not quite Celtic runes, but something altogether different. I ran my fingers over the symbol that had glowed yesterday, the one that had saved my life. It remained cool to the touch, showing no signs of the power it had displayed. I sketched it carefully in my notebook, along with the others I could see. As I worked, a thought struck me. This clearing, this altar, they hadn't been stumbled upon by chance. Someone or something had created this place. But who and why? I found myself wishing I had paid more attention in my college anthropology class. I spent the rest of the morning examining the clearing, taking notes and sketches, trying to find any clue that might explain what this place was and why it was here. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, I reluctantly packed up my things, knowing I needed to head back to the campsite before I lost the light. Just as I was about to leave, something caught my eye. Half buried in the leaves at the base of one of the trees surrounding the clearing was what looked like a scrap of leather. I brushed away the leaves to reveal an old weathered journal, its pages yellow with age. My heart racing with excitement, I carefully opened the journal. The pages were filled with cramped, spidery handwriting, much of it faded and difficult to read. But what I could make out sent a chill down my spine. The writer, whoever they were, described encounters with creatures that sounded eerily similar to what I had seen. There were sketches, too, crude but unmistakable depictions of the wolf-like being. I clutched the journal to my chest, knowing I had stumbled upon something important. This was proof that I wasn't crazy, that what I had seen was real. But it also opened up a whole new set of questions. Who had written this journal, and what had happened to them? As I made my way back to the campsite, my mind was whirling with possibilities. I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't leave now. Whatever was happening in these woods, whatever secrets this forest held, I was now a part of it. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Back at the RV, I spread out my notes and the old journal on the small table. I had originally planned this trip as a way to relax, to recover from my heart attack and reassess my life. Instead, I had stumbled into a mystery that defied explanation. As night fell, I found myself looking out the window of the RV into the darkness of the forest. Somewhere out there, the creature was roaming. Somewhere out there were answers to questions I hadn't even known to ask a few days ago. I thought about Sarah and the kids, about my life back in New York. I should call them, I knew. I should tell them, what? That I had encountered a mythical beast in the woods, that I had found an ancient altar with mysterious powers. They'd think I'd lost my mind. No, I decided. I couldn't leave, not yet. But I couldn't drag my family into this either. Whatever was happening here, I needed to figure it out on my own. I owed it to myself and to whoever had written that journal to uncover the truth. As I settled in for another uneasy night, I realized that for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. The panic attacks that had plagued me since my heart attack were gone, replaced by a sense of purpose and excitement. Arthur Malvin, former investment banker and reluctant camper, was now on a mission to uncover the secrets of the Monongahela National Forest, no matter where they might lead. Little did I know, as I drifted off to sleep, that my adventure was only just beginning. The forest held deeper secrets than I could have imagined, and uncovering them would test me in ways I never thought possible. But that's a story for another time. The next few days passed in a blur of research and exploration. I pored over the old journal, deciphering what I could of the faded handwriting. The author, who signed their entries only as J.H., seemed to have been a researcher of some kind, investigating legends of strange creatures in the Appalachian Mountains. J.H.'s entries spoke of multiple encounters with the wolf-like beings, which they referred to as guardians. But more intriguingly, they mentioned other clearings, other stone altars scattered throughout the forest. According to J.H., these altars were part of an ancient network, a sort of mystical defense system created by an unknown civilization long ago. Armed with this new information, I set out each day to explore deeper into the forest. I found 2 more clearings, each with its own altar. The symbols carved into them were similar to the ones I'd first encountered, but subtly different. I carefully sketched each one, trying to decipher their meanings. As I explored, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Occasionally, I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, or hear that now familiar rustling in the underbrush. But whatever was out there seemed content to observe from a distance. It was on the 5th day of my investigations that everything changed. I had hiked further than ever before, following coordinates I'd deciphered from J.H.'s journal. The forest here was older, the trees massive and gnarled with age. The very air seemed charged with an ancient power. As I pushed through a thick curtain of vines, I found myself in the largest clearing yet. At its center stood not a single altar, but a circle of standing stones, each easily twice my height. They surrounded a raised platform of intricate stonework, covered in symbols that glowed with a faint, pulsing light. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. This had to be what J.H. had been searching for, the heart of the ancient network. As I stepped onto the platform, the symbols flared to life, their glow intensifying until the entire clearing was bathed in ethereal light. And then they came. From between the trees, silent as shadows, emerged the guardians. There were 5 of them, each as terrifying and majestic as the one I'd first encountered. But this time, they made no move to attack. Instead, they formed a circle around the platform, their eyes fixed on me. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Then, acting on instinct, I placed my hand on the central symbol of the platform, just as I had done with the first altar. The effect was immediate and astonishing. Images flooded my mind, too fast to fully comprehend. I saw flashes of an ancient civilization, of great cities hidden within the mountains. I saw the guardians, not as monsters but as protectors, created to watch over the land long after their creators had vanished. And I saw the threat, a creeping darkness that sought to corrupt and destroy, held at bay only by the network of altars and the vigilance of the guardians. As the vision faded, I found myself on my knees, gasping for breath. The guardians still surrounded me, but their posture had changed. They were waiting, expectant. Somehow I understood that by activating the central altar, I had proven myself. I was no longer an intruder, but a potential ally. One of the guardians approached, its movements now graceful rather than menacing. It extended a clawed hand, and in it was a small stone carved with the same symbols as the altars. A key, I realized, a way to activate and control the network. As I reached out to take the stone, I hesitated. Was I ready for this responsibility? Could I dedicate my life to protecting this ancient secret, to standing against a threat I barely understood? I thought of my family, of my life back in New York. Could I really leave all that behind? But then I remembered the person I had been before this journey. Stressed, unfulfilled, literally working myself to death. Here in this forest I had found something real, something important. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive. I took the stone. The effect was immediate. The symbols on the platform flared once more, and I felt a surge of energy course through me. Knowledge flooded my mind. How to activate the altars, how to communicate with the guardians, how to sense the encroaching darkness. I understood now why J.H. had never returned from the forest. This wasn't a task you could abandon once you accepted it. As the light faded and the guardians melted back into the forest, I sat on the edge of the platform, turning the stone over in my hands. I knew what I had to do next, and it wasn't going to be easy. The hike back to my campsite took several hours, but I barely noticed the time passing. My mind was too full of everything I had learned, everything I had committed to. By the time I reached the RV, night had fallen, and I knew it was time to make some difficult phone calls. Sarah answered on the second ring, her voice a mixture of relief and worry. "Arthur, is everything okay? We've been so worried." I took a deep breath. "Everything's fine, Sarah. Better than fine, actually, but we need to talk." Over the next hour, I did my best to explain what had happened, what I had discovered. I told her about the Guardians, about the ancient network, about the responsibility I had accepted. I could hear the disbelief in her voice, the concern that I might have lost my mind out here in the wilderness. "I know it sounds crazy," I said, "but it's real, Sarah, all of it, and it's important. More important than anything I've ever done." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "What does this mean, Arthur? For us, for the family?" I closed my eyes, fighting back tears. "I can't come back, not permanently. It's a calling, Sarah. I have to see it through." What followed was one of the most difficult conversations of my life. There were tears, accusations, pleas for me to come to my senses. But underneath it all, I could hear something else in Sarah's voice, understanding. She knew me better than anyone, and she could hear the conviction in my words, the sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. In the end, we came to an agreement. I would return to New York briefly, to put my affairs in order, and to show Sarah and the kids what I had discovered. After that, I would return to the forest, but not forever. We would find a way to balance my new responsibilities with my role as a husband and father. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. I returned to New York, where I faced skepticism and concern from my family and colleagues. But when I brought Sarah and the kids to the forest, when they saw the altars and met the guardians, all doubts were erased. Emily, always the adventurous one, was thrilled by the idea of her dad as a mystical forest guardian. Michael took a bit more convincing, but the technological aspects of the ancient network fascinated him. And Sarah, seeing me truly happy and fulfilled for the first time in years, gave her blessing to this new chapter in our lives. I retired from the investment firm, much to the shock of my colleagues. We sold our Manhattan apartment and bought a small cabin on the outskirts of the Monongahela National Forest. Close enough for me to perform my duties as a guardian, but not so far that I couldn't be part of my family's life. As for the work itself, it was more challenging and rewarding than anything I had ever done. I spent my days maintaining the altar network, communing with the guardians, and tracking the movements of the dark force that threatened the land. I started training others, passing on the knowledge that had been entrusted to me. It wasn't always easy. There were times when the darkness pressed close, when I faced challenges that made my most stressful days as a banker seem like a walk in the park. But I was never alone. I had the wisdom of the ancients, the strength of the guardians, and the love of my family to support me. And so, life settled into a new rhythm. My heart, once strained by the stresses of city life, grew stronger with each day spent in the forest. The panic attacks that had plagued me became a distant memory. I had found my purpose, my place in the world. Sometimes, in the quiet moments when I sat by a campfire or stood atop a mountain, watching the mist roll through the valleys below, I thought back to that first reluctant camping trip. How could I have known that a doctor's orders to reduce stress would lead me here? That in trying to save my life, I would find a new one entirely. I, Arthur Malvin, former investment banker and reluctant camper, had become a guardian of an ancient secret, a protector of powers beyond imagination. My name is Ethan, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me in 2018. It's a story I've tried to forget, but the memories are etched into my mind like claw marks on bark. It all started when my old man and I decided to try something different for our annual vacation. Dad's always been an avid hunter, and I've been tagging along since I could walk. We'd spend weekends in the fall chasing whitetails back home, but this time we wanted to go big. Montana big. The plan was to bag ourselves an elk, those majestic creatures that roam the Rockies. Mom opted to stay home, so it was just the two of us. We spent weeks researching, poring over maps and watching hunting videos. Finally, we booked a guide and packed up our gear. The drive to Montana was long, but we made the most of it, stopping at scenic overlooks and roadside attractions. As we crossed into Big Sky country, the landscape transformed. Gone were the familiar rolling hills of home, replaced by vast prairies that stretched to the horizon. Then came the mountains, their snow-capped peaks piercing the clouds. We even stopped at a natural hot spring, where the sulphurous smell made me gag, while Dad laughed at my discomfort. After days on the road, we finally reached our destination, a remote corner of national forest that promised prime elk hunting. Our guide, a burly man named Jack, met us at a tiny general store on the outskirts of a town so small it barely deserved the name. Jack was a character straight out of a frontier novel. His beard was thick and wild, streaked with grey, and his eyes held the kind of wisdom that comes from a lifetime in the wilderness. He spoke with a slow drawl, peppering his speech with colloquialisms I'd never heard before. "You boys ready to chase some wapiti?" he asked, using the Native American term for elk. We nodded eagerly, and he led us deep into the forest. Our home for the next week was a rustic cabin that had seen better days. The wood was weathered, and the roof looked like it might not survive a heavy snowfall. Inside, a pot-bellied stove squatted in one corner, surrounded by stacks of firewood. 2 narrow cots and a rickety table completed the sparse furnishings. That first night, we heated up some canned chili and listened to Jack's stories of past hunts. He spread out a topographic map on the table, pointing out promising areas and warning us about treacherous ravines. As I drifted off to sleep, my mind was filled with visions of majestic bulls and the thrill of the hunt. The next few days were a blur of early mornings, long hikes, and endless waiting. The terrain was unlike anything I'd experienced before. The hills were steeper, the forests denser, and the air noticeably thinner as we climbed higher into the mountains. My legs burned with each ascent, and my lungs struggled to pull in enough oxygen. We caught glimpses of elk, a flash of tawny hide, the crack of a branch, but never got close enough for a clean shot. Jack assured us this was normal. "Elk are ghosts," he said. "You gotta be patient and outsmart 'em." Dad took it all in stride, his weathered face set in lines of concentration. He'd cracked the occasional joke about my heavy breathing, scaring off all the game, but I could see the determination in his eyes. This hunt meant something to him, a challenge he was eager to conquer. It was on the 4th night that everything changed. I woke in the pitch black of the cabin, disoriented and uneasy. The usual nighttime sounds of the forest, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of wind through pine needles, were absent. An unnatural silence blanketed everything. Then I heard it. A low, deliberate rustling from outside the cabin. My heart began to race as I nudged Dad awake. He grumbled and rolled over, still half asleep. Slowly, I crept to the grimy window and peered out into the darkness. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, hunched against an ancient pine near our woodshed, was a shadow. But this was no ordinary shadow cast by moonlight. This was a solid mass of darkness, far larger than any human. It stood motionless, as if aware of my gaze, a sentinel of the night that didn't belong in this world of light and reason. I stumbled back to my cot, my mind reeling. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, a bear maybe, or my imagination running wild in this unfamiliar place. But deep down I knew something was out there, something that defied explanation. The next morning, I recounted what I'd seen to Dad and Jack. They exchanged glances, clearly skeptical, but unwilling to dismiss my fears entirely. Jack suggested it might have been a moose or a particularly large black bear. Dad clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Probably just first-time jitters, son. Let's focus on the hunt." But I couldn't shake the feeling of wrongness that had settled over me. As we hiked out to our hunting spot that day, every shadow seemed to conceal a threat, every rustle in the underbrush a harbinger of something sinister. Jack set us up in a small clearing. The plan was for him to use his elk call to lure in a bull, while Dad and I waited in concealment. We settled into our camp chairs, rifles at the ready as Jack moved a short distance away. The forest fell silent as we waited. Then Jack began his call, a high, eerie bugle that echoed through the trees. The sound raised the hair on the back of my neck, not because of its alienness, but because of how it sliced through the unnatural quiet that had descended upon the woods. We sat for hours, barely moving, barely breathing. Dad was a statue beside me, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. I tried to mirror his calm, but my nerves were frayed. That's when I heard it again, that same rustling from the night before, coming from the direction of our cabin. I wanted to say something, to alert Dad, but the strict rules of the hunt kept me silent. Then Jack bugled again, and this time something answered. It wasn't the answering call of an elk, though. It was the crash of breaking branches, the sound of something massive moving through the dense undergrowth. Heavy, thudding steps followed. Whatever was approaching it was close, too close, and it was definitely not an elk. My heart hammered in my chest as I saw movement through the trees. Then it emerged, and my world shattered. The creature that stepped into view defied comprehension. It stood at least 9 feet tall, its body covered in thick dark fur. It walked on 2 legs, but not like any animal I'd ever seen. Its gait was somewhere between an ape and a man, but magnified to nightmarish proportions. Massive clawed hands swung at its sides and its head. God, its head! A long, tapered snout full of teeth, small eyes glinting with an intelligence that had no place in a forest creature. I froze, unable to move, unable to think. Beside me, Dad had gone rigid, his knuckles white on his rifle. The monster, because what else could I call it, stopped about 30 feet from our position. It seemed to study us, its head tilting in an almost quizzical manner. For a terrifying moment, I thought it might try to communicate. Then it let out a bone-chilling growl, low and rumbling, that seemed to vibrate the very air around us. And it charged. Dad was on his feet in an instant, his rifle already at his shoulder. The boom of the first shot jolted me back to reality. I scrambled for my own weapon as Dad fired again and again. The creature flinched with each impact, but kept coming, its speed terrifying for something so large. My hand shook as I raised my rifle and squeezed the trigger. The recoil slammed into my shoulder, but I barely felt it. I fired again and again, the sound of our combined shots deafening in the confined space of the clearing. The monster roared in pain and fury. It stumbled, crashing into a nearby tree with such force that dead branches rained down around us. For a moment, hope surged through me. Maybe we'd hurt it enough. Maybe we had a chance. But the thing wasn't done. It lunged back to its feet with shocking agility, barreling through the underbrush like a freight train of fur and claws. We kept firing until our rifles clicked empty, the echoes of gunfire rolling through the mountains like thunder. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature vanished. The forest fell silent once more, broken only by the ping of hot shell casings hitting the ground and our ragged breathing. We waited, every muscle tense, for any sign of the monster's return. 1 minute passed, then 2. I became acutely aware of every sound. The rustle of leaves, the creak of branches in the wind. Dad's face was a mask of grim determination, his eyes scanning the tree line for any hint of movement. Slowly, cautiously, we began to move forward. We followed the trail of destruction left by the creature's charge. Broken branches churned earth, but strangely, no blood. How could something take that many hits and not leave a trace? That's when I saw it. Pressed into a patch of soft earth was a single, massive footprint. The impression was deep, with clear claw marks at the end of each toe. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Not human, not bear, not any animal I could name. This was the proof. This thing was real. We backtracked to the cabin, moving in a tight formation with Jack on point. Every sense was on high alert, straining for any sign that the creature was still out there. But there was nothing, just an oppressive silence that seemed to watch us with malevolent intent. Back at the cabin, we barricaded the door and checked every window. Jack lit the wood stove, but its warmth did little to dispel the chill that had settled into my bones. We didn't talk much. What was there to say? We'd seen something impossible, something that shouldn't exist outside of campfire stories and horror movies. We took turns keeping watch through the night. Sleep came in fitful bursts, every creak of the cabin's old bones jolting me awake with visions of that monstrous form looming over me. When dawn finally broke, we ventured out to search the area. There was no sign of the creature, but that feeling of being watched never left me. By unspoken agreement, we packed our gear in grim silence. This trip was over. We'd tempted fate once and survived. We wouldn't push our luck again. The drive back to civilization was tense and quiet. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what we'd seen. But there was no explaining it away. That thing had been real as the rifle in my hands, as real as the terror still coursing through my veins. We stopped at the first town we came to, a small place called Pine Ridge. Without discussion, we headed straight for the sheriff's office. I felt ridiculous as we recounted our tale. Who would believe us? A giant bipedal monster roaming the Montana wilderness? We sounded like madmen. The deputy who took our statement listened with poorly concealed skepticism. But then an older officer, his badge identifying him as Sheriff Hank Larson, approached with interest. "You boys were up in the Blackwater Range, weren't you?" he asked, his voice gravelly with age and cigarettes. We nodded and he sighed heavily. "We get reports, you know. Not often, but regular enough. Hikers seeing things they can't explain. Hunters coming back with stories that don't make sense." He paused, his weathered face creased with concern. "Couple years back, we had a group go missing up there. 5 people. Never found a trace." A chill ran down my spine. People had disappeared in those mountains, and we had come so close to joining them. I looked at Dad and saw the same realization in his eyes. Whatever was out there, it had been taking people for years. Sheriff Larson took a detailed report, writing down every aspect of our encounter. When he was done, he looked at us seriously. "I can't say I know what's going on up there," he said, "but I believe you saw something. And I promise you we're going to look into it." As we left the sheriff's office, a heavy silence fell over us. There was an understanding now, a shared knowledge of something beyond the normal world. We drove away from Pine Ridge and I never looked back. But the memory stayed with me. In the years since, in the quiet of night when the shadows grow long, I sometimes see that dark shape moving through the trees. I hear the crash of its footsteps, the rumble of its inhuman growl. The terror is as fresh as the day it happened, but I also remember the look in Sheriff Larson's eyes. It wasn't dismissal I saw there, but a spark of recognition, a determination to uncover the truth. Maybe, with enough people speaking up, with enough evidence gathered, we can shed light on what lurks in the dark corners of our world. I don't know if I'll ever go back to those mountains, but I know that something is out there watching and waiting, and I can only hope that someday we'll be ready to face it. I never believed in folklore or ghost stories growing up in Western New York. To me, they were just bedtime tales designed to keep kids from wandering too far from home. At least, that's what I used to think. Now, after what happened at Black Hollow Cabin, I understand why our ancestors created those warnings. Some things are better left undisturbed, some places better left unexplored. I grew up in a small town near the Catskills, where my father worked as a park ranger and my mother taught biology at the local high school. They instilled in me a deep respect for nature, but also a scientific mindset. Everything had an explanation, they taught me. Everything followed natural laws. I carried that certainty through my childhood and into my teens, even as I heard the old stories about things that lived in the deep woods, about hikers who disappeared and were never found. Our group came together naturally over the years. Eli Mitchell I'd known since elementary school, a quiet, thoughtful guy who could identify any bird by its call and track deer through the densest underbrush. His father had taught him wilderness survival skills, and he passed that knowledge on to me during countless weekend camping trips. Tess Rodriguez joined our circle in 9th grade when her family moved up from Florida. She was fearless, the kind of person who would climb the tallest trees just to see what the view was like from the top. She never quite got used to our cold winters, but she loved the mountains with a passion that matched my own. Connor Walsh was the wild card. He transferred to our school in junior year and immediately clicked with our group, bringing an energy and spontaneity that balanced out our more cautious natures. He came from old money, though you'd never know it by his worn jeans and beat-up pickup truck. His family owned property all through the mountains, including, as we would later learn, Black Hollow Cabin. Megan Chen was the last to join our circle, moving to town in senior year. She was brilliant, headed to Cornell on a full scholarship to study environmental science. She and Connor started dating almost immediately, one of those high school romances that seemed destined to last forever. Now, I can't think about either of them without remembering how it all ended. We were all 19 that summer of '98, caught in that strange limbo between high school and whatever came next. College loomed ahead of us. I was headed to SUNY, Eli to Vermont, Tess to Boston University. We wanted one last adventure together before our lives pulled us in different directions. That's what Connor promised us with Black Hollow Cabin. One last weekend in the mountains, just the 5 of us. Looking back, there were warning signs from the beginning. The way Connor's uncle hesitated when he handed over the keys, the strange looks we got from locals when we stopped for supplies, the fact that no one could quite tell us how to get there. But we were young and invincible, or so we thought. What could possibly go wrong in a cabin in the woods? I remember the last normal moment before everything changed. We were sitting around the scarred kitchen table playing cards, warm light spilling from the old kerosene lamp, Megan's laugh echoing off the wooden walls as Connor told another of his ridiculous stories. The windows were dark mirrors reflecting our faces back at us, and beyond them the forest waited. None of us knew it then, but that forest had been waiting for a very long time. The planning started innocently enough. Connor showed us pictures of the cabin on his phone, an old 2-story structure built in the 1920s, all weathered wood and stone chimney. It looked rustic but charming, nestled in a clearing surrounded by ancient maples and pines. My uncle hasn't used it much lately, Connor said, scrolling through the photos. Says it needs some work, but it's got running water and electricity. We'll have the whole place to ourselves. I noticed he avoided mentioning why his uncle had stopped using it, but at the time it didn't seem important. Eli, ever practical, insisted on proper preparation. We spent weeks gathering supplies, sleeping bags rated for cold weather, emergency flares, first aid kits, extra batteries for flashlights. The nearest town is 2 hours away, he reminded us. We need to be self-sufficient. Tess mapped out hiking trails in the area, marking potential routes on topographical maps. But something was off. The cabin's location didn't quite match any official maps. When she mentioned this to Connor, he shrugged it off. The property's been in my family forever. Some of these trails don't show up on modern maps. Megan, studying the weather forecast, frowned at her laptop. That's weird, she said. The temperature predictions for that area are all over the place. It's like the weather patterns don't make sense. I remember helping her pack her camera gear the night before we left. She was excited about photographing the local wildlife, especially the deer that Connor said frequently visited the clearing around the cabin. There's something special about that place, he'd told us. The animals act different there. None of us thought to ask what he meant by different. We left early Friday morning, Connor's truck loaded with our gear. The drive started normally enough, highways giving way to state roads, then to increasingly narrow mountain paths. But as we turned onto the unmarked gravel road that led to the cabin, something changed. The forest pressed closer, branches reaching over the road like grasping fingers. The air grew thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. Even the sunlight seemed different, filtering through the leaves in strange patterns that made my eyes hurt if I looked at them too long. "Anyone else feel that?" Tess asked from the back seat, her voice tight. "Like pressure in your ears?" We all nodded. It was like descending in an airplane, but worse. A deep, throbbing sensation that made my teeth ache. The cabin appeared suddenly around a bend, looking exactly like the photos, but somehow more imposing in person. The windows were dark, reflecting the trees in a way that made them look like they were moving inside the glass. As we unloaded our gear, I noticed something odd about the clearing. There were no birds singing, no insects buzzing. Just complete, unnatural silence. The first night passed uneventfully, but none of us slept well. The silence was oppressive, broken only by occasional sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, like something large moving through the trees, but never visible from the windows. Saturday morning, we decided to explore the surrounding woods. The trail Tess had mapped led us deeper into the forest, where the trees grew older and stranger. Their trunks were twisted into unnatural shapes, bark scarred with marks that looked disturbingly like written symbols. Then we found the clearing. It was perfectly circular, about 30 feet across. Every plant within its boundaries was dead, the ground covered in a layer of ash-gray moss that seemed to pulse slightly when you looked at it too long. But it was what we found in the center that made my blood run cold. Bones, arranged in a complex pattern that couldn't have been natural. Some were clearly animal, deer, maybe wolf, but others looked human, and they were all pointing towards something, a cave entrance half hidden by fallen trees, its mouth a perfect black oval in the rock face. "We should go," Eli said, his voice barely a whisper. "Now." As we turned to leave, Megan's camera clicked. The sound echoed strangely in the clearing, and something answered from the cave, a low, wet sound that might have been breathing. We ran. That night, things got worse. The temperature dropped rapidly, frost forming on the inside of the windows despite the summer heat. We huddled around the fireplace, trying to convince ourselves there were rational explanations for everything we'd seen. Then Megan went missing. 1 minute she was there, getting up to use the bathroom. The next, gone. The bathroom window was open, though we all swore it had been closed. Outside, her footprints led toward the woods, but they changed as they went, becoming longer, deeper, wrong. We had to search for her. Connor grabbed his rifle, Eli took the flares, and Tess carried the first aid kit. I brought up the rear with the most powerful flashlight we had. The beam seemed weak against the darkness, which felt almost solid, pressing against us like cold hands. We found her camera first, lying in the dead clearing. The screen was cracked but still working, showing the last photo she'd taken. A figure standing in the cave mouth. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that bent in too many places. Its face was... I still can't describe its face. My mind won't let me. That's when we heard Megan scream. Not from the cave, but from above us. We looked up, and there it was, moving through the treetops like a spider, carrying something that might have been Megan but wasn't anymore. Connor fired. The sound was deafening in the clearing, but the creature didn't seem to notice. Instead, it laughed, a sound like breaking glass and crying children mixed together. More figures emerged from the cave. They moved like liquid shadow, their forms constantly shifting between things I recognized, deer, bear, human, and things that couldn't exist in our world. "Run!" Eli screamed, lighting a flare. The red light seemed to hurt them. They recoiled, their forms rippling like heat waves over hot pavement. What happened next is fragmented in my memory. Running through the woods, branches whipping our faces. Tess falling, being pulled into the darkness as she screamed. Connor emptying his rifle into something that used to be Megan. Eli's last flare, revealing dozens of creatures surrounding us, herding us back toward the cabin. I remember the cabin's windows, glowing with a pale corpse light from within. Remember Connor saying, "I'm sorry," before stepping into their midst, arms spread wide. Remember Eli pushing me toward his truck, starting the engine, as things with too many limbs and too many eyes crashed through the underbrush behind us. We made it to the highway somehow. Eli was bleeding from wounds that wouldn't stop changing shape. He died before we reached the hospital, his last words a warning, "Don't let them follow us back." The official investigation went nowhere. Missing persons reports were filed. Search parties found nothing. Not the cabin, not the cave, not even the clearing. Connor's uncle claimed there had never been a cabin on their property. My dreams are haunted by what I saw in those woods. Sometimes I wake up to find frost on my windows in the middle of summer, or catch glimpses of impossible shapes moving at the edge of my vision. Over the years, I've heard stories. Other groups of friends who ventured into those mountains and never returned. Hikers finding clearings with arranged bones. Strange sounds in the night that make people's teeth ache. I've connected with others who survived similar encounters. They speak of ancient things that live in the dark places of the world, things that wear human shapes but aren't human at all. Things that hunger not just for flesh, but for something deeper, consciousness, identity, soul. I still live in the area, though I never go into the woods anymore. Sometimes on very quiet nights, I think I can hear them, that wet, strange laughter carried on the wind. And sometimes when I look at old photos of my friends, their faces seem to shift and change, becoming something else entirely. I know they're still out there, waiting in the darkness between the trees. And I know that someday they'll find their way back to our world. The cabin was just a doorway, one of many. The real horror isn't that such things exist. It's that they've always been here, watching, waiting, wearing familiar faces until the moment they choose to reveal themselves. If you're planning a trip to the mountains, my advice is simple: stick to marked trails. Don't explore unknown cabins. And if you find yourself in a place where the silence feels wrong and the trees seem to watch you, run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because sometimes the monsters in our stories aren't just stories. Sometimes they're memories of things that were here long before us, things that will remain long after we're gone. And sometimes they get hungry.